Have you ever watched someone burn the bridge they're standing on? That's exactly what happened when my son Derek stood in the doorway of what he thought was his house and told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. His new in-laws needed the space, he said, and my presence was making his wife uncomfortable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Derek didn't know was that I wasn't just his mother being kicked out of his home. I was his landlord serving him an eviction notice he'd never see coming. The look on his face when the registered mail arrived 3 weeks later told me everything. I needed to know about the son I thought I'd raised. I never imagined I'd be the kind of mother who would have to legally evict her own child. But sometimes life has a way of teaching us lessons we never wanted to learn. My name is Linda Rodriguez, and at 62 years old, I thought I understood family loyalty. I was wrong about a lot of things, but most of all, I was wrong about my son. Growing up in East Portland wasn't easy, but it taught me the value of hard work and perseverance. My parents, both immigrants from El Salvador, worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. My father spent his days in construction and his nights cleaning office buildings downtown. My mother worked as a seamstress during the day and cleaned houses on weekends. They never complained, never made excuses, and always reminded my brother and me that education was our ticket to a better life. I took their words to heart. While other kids were out partying, I was studying, working part-time jobs, and saving every penny I could. I put myself through Portland State University, earning a degree in business administration while working at a local bank. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it gave me something my parents never had: financial stability and the knowledge of how money really works. After graduation, I started at the bank as a junior loan officer, but I had bigger dreams. I watched people come in day after day, desperate for loans to buy homes they couldn't afford, or seeking help after making poor financial decisions. It broke my heart, but it also opened my eyes to opportunity. I began studying real estate investment on my own time, reading every book I could find, attending seminars, and slowly building my knowledge of property markets. My first investment property was a small duplex in Southeast Portland that needed significant work. I bought it with my savings and a loan that stretched my budget to the breaking point. For 6 months, I spent every weekend and evening fixing plumbing, painting walls, and learning how to be a landlord. It was exhausting, but when I finally rented out both units, the monthly income was enough to cover the mortgage and put a little extra in my pocket. That's when I met Roberto, Derek's father. He was working as an electrician on one of my renovation projects, and his work ethic matched my own. Roberto understood dreams and wasn't intimidated by my ambitions. When other men seemed threatened by my growing real estate portfolio, he encouraged me to buy more properties. We married after 2 years of dating, and Derek came along 18 months later. Roberto was a wonderful father and husband, but life had other plans for us. When Derek was 12, Roberto was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The disease moved quickly, and within 8 months, I was a single mother trying to hold everything together while grieving the loss of the man I thought I'd grow old with. Roberto's life insurance helped with immediate expenses, but I knew I had to secure Derek's future on my own. By then, I owned 4 rental properties and had developed a reputation as a fair but firm landlord. The income from my rentals, combined with my salary from the bank, where I'd been promoted to senior loan officer, provided financial stability. More importantly, it gave me the flexibility to be present for Derek during those crucial teenage years when he needed me most. Derek was a good kid, or at least I thought he was. He did well in school, played basketball, and seemed to appreciate the sacrifices I'd made for our family. When he graduated high school, I was proud to pay for his college education at the University of Oregon without him having to take on student loans. It was something I'd dreamed of since he was born, giving him opportunities I never had. After college, Derek moved back to Portland and found work at a tech startup downtown. He was living in a small apartment and complaining about the rent. So when I purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman house in the Eastmoreland neighborhood as an investment property, I offered to let him live there temporarily while he got established in his career. The house was perfect for a young professional. Updated kitchen, hardwood floors, a small backyard, and located in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods. The arrangement seemed ideal. Derek would live there rent-free for 6 months while he saved money, and then we'd transition to a fair rental agreement that would be below market rate. It was a win-win situation, or so I thought. What I didn't anticipate was that Derek would start seeing the house as his own, or that temporarily would stretch into 5 years without any discussion of rent or formal lease agreements. I didn't push the issue because Derek was my son, and seeing him happy and settled brought me joy. He was building his career, dating occasionally, and seemed to be finding his way in life. The house was being maintained, and having family in one of my properties felt like the natural thing to do. Besides, the other 3 rental properties I owned provided enough income to cover my expenses and continue growing my investment portfolio. Everything changed when Derek met Vanessa Hampton at a company networking event. Vanessa was beautiful, polished, and came from the kind of wealth that Derek had never experienced. Her father, Richard Hampton, owned Hampton and Associates, a successful investment firm that managed portfolios for Portland's elite. Her mother, Catherine, devoted her time to charity work and social functions that required formal invitations and designer gowns. The Hampton family lived in a sprawling estate in the West Hills, complete with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and views of the city below. It was the kind of home featured in architectural magazines where every detail was perfectly curated and every guest was carefully vetted. When Derek started dating Vanessa, he was immediately drawn into this world of privilege and status that felt foreign to everything he'd known growing up. I first met Vanessa at a casual dinner I hosted at my small apartment in the Selwood district. I'd prepared Derek's favorite meal, my mother's recipe for pupusas, rice and beans, and fresh salsa. It was the kind of home-cooked meal that had sustained our family through good times and bad, made with love and traditional ingredients that connected us to our heritage. Vanessa arrived dressed as if she were attending a business meeting in a crisp white blouse and expensive-looking pants that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. She was polite but distant, picking at her food and asking careful questions about the ingredients as if she were conducting a dietary investigation. When I mentioned that the pupusas were made from my grandmother's recipe, she smiled tightly and said she was trying to eat less processed flour. The evening was uncomfortable, but I attributed it to first meeting nerves. Derek seemed happy, and that was what mattered to me. He talked about Vanessa's family, their business success, and the social events they attended with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was a child talking about Christmas morning. It was clear that this relationship was opening doors to a lifestyle he found appealing. Over the following months, Derek's visits to my apartment became less frequent. He was always busy with work, social functions, or weekend trips with Vanessa's family. When we did see each other, he seemed different, more conscious of his appearance, more careful with his words, and less interested in the simple conversations we used to enjoy about his work, his dreams, or even the latest book I was reading. The first time I met Richard and Catherine Hampton was at Derek and Vanessa's engagement party, held at the Hampton estate. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, something appropriate but not too expensive, and arrived with a bottle of wine and a card congratulating the happy couple. The valet who took my 10-year-old Honda Civic looked puzzled, as if he weren't sure whether I was a guest or someone making a delivery. Inside the house, everything was perfect in that way that only significant money can achieve. Fresh flowers, filled crystal vases in every room, servers in formal uniforms offered champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and guests mingled in designer clothing while discussing vacation homes and stock portfolios. I felt immediately out of place, but I was there for Derek, so I put on my best smile and tried to navigate the social minefield. Catherine Hampton was gracious in the way that wealthy women often are with people they consider beneath their social station. She thanked me for coming, complimented my dress in a tone that suggested surprise at my ability to dress appropriately, and introduced me to other guests as Derek's mother, without mentioning my name or anything about my background. It was subtle, but the message was clear. I was present by association, not by merit. Richard was more direct in his assessment. During our brief conversation, he asked about my work, and when I mentioned that I was a senior loan officer at Columbia River Bank, he nodded dismissively and said banking was a stable career choice for someone with my background. When I mentioned my real estate investments, hoping to find common ground, he smiled condescendingly and said small-scale residential properties were a good way for regular people to build modest wealth. The evening continued with me feeling increasingly isolated among Derek's new social circle. Conversations flowed around topics I had no experience with: private clubs, European vacations, children's boarding schools, and investment strategies that required millions in capital. I watched Derek navigate these discussions with growing confidence, laughing at jokes I didn't understand and sharing stories about experiences I hadn't known he'd had. When it came time for the traditional toasts, Richard Hampton spoke eloquently about welcoming Derek into their family, praising his ambition and his potential for growth under their guidance. He spoke as if Derek were a promising employee being groomed for promotion rather than a son-in-law being embraced with love. Derek beamed at the recognition, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. My toast was brief and heartfelt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I talked about watching Derek grow from a curious child into a hardworking man, about the values his father had instilled in him, and about my hopes for his happiness in marriage. The room was polite, but distracted, and I could feel the difference between my simple words and the sophisticated speeches that had come before. When I finished, Derek hugged me quickly and moved on to other conversations, leaving me standing alone with my half-empty glass of champagne. The wedding planning process was an education in power dynamics that I hadn't expected. Catherine Hampton took control immediately, scheduling meetings at times when I was working, choosing venues and vendors without consulting my preferences, and making decisions that assumed financial contributions I hadn't agreed to make. When I suggested that Derek and I discuss how expenses would be shared, Catherine looked at me with barely concealed pity and said she understood that some families had budget constraints that needed to be considered. Derek seemed oblivious to these undercurrents, or perhaps he'd chosen to ignore them. When I tried to talk to him about feeling excluded from planning decisions, he assured me that Catherine was just being helpful and that I shouldn't take her efficiency personally. He suggested that maybe I was feeling sensitive because I wasn't used to events of this scale, and that perhaps I should be grateful that Vanessa's family was willing to handle most of the arrangements. The wedding itself was a beautiful affair that showcased the Hampton family's taste and resources. The ceremony was held at a historic mansion overlooking the Columbia River, with professional photographers capturing every moment, and a reception that featured a live band, gourmet cuisine, and floral arrangements that probably cost more than some people's cars. I wore a dress I'd splurged on for the occasion and tried to smile through a day that felt more like a performance than a celebration. During the reception, I found myself seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, while Derek's new in-laws occupied the prime spots near the head table. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental. It was a clear indication of where I ranked in the new family hierarchy. I watched Derek dance with his new wife, pose for photographs with the Hampton family, and deliver a speech that thanked his new in-laws for their guidance and support while mentioning his own family only briefly. After the wedding, the changes in Derek became more pronounced. His visits to my apartment stopped entirely, and our phone conversations became shorter and more focused on practical matters. When I called to check on him, he was often busy with work events, social functions, or weekend plans with Vanessa's family. The easy relationship we'd shared when he was growing up felt like a distant memory, replaced by polite but distant interactions that left me feeling like an acquaintance rather than his mother. The first major holiday after the wedding was Thanksgiving, and I assumed Derek and Vanessa would join me for our traditional meal. I'd been preparing our family's Thanksgiving feast the same way for decades: turkey with my mother's stuffing recipe, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and pumpkin pie made from scratch. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and memories of holidays past. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Derek called to tell me they wouldn't be coming. The Hampton family had invited them to join their celebration at the country club, he explained, and it would be good for his career to attend. He suggested that maybe we could get together the following weekend instead, perhaps for a casual lunch somewhere convenient. The casual dismissal of our family tradition stung more than I wanted to admit, but I told him I understood and hoped he'd have a wonderful time. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time since Roberto died, eating a small turkey breast and watching football games while trying not to think about Derek laughing and socializing with his new family. The following weekend, lunch never happened. Derek called to postpone, then reschedule, then eventually stopped mentioning it altogether. Christmas followed the same pattern. The Hampton family had elaborate traditions that required Derek and Vanessa's full participation, leaving no time for the simple gift exchange and home-cooked meal that had been our custom. I sent presents to the Eastmoreland house and received a thank you text message in response. When I suggested meeting for coffee to exchange gifts in person, Derek explained that their schedule was completely booked with holiday obligations. The distance between us continued to grow throughout their first year of marriage. Derek's conversations became increasingly focused on his new lifestyle: dinners at exclusive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, social events that required formal attire and social connections I didn't possess. He spoke about these experiences with enthusiasm, but never invited me to participate or seemed to consider that I might feel excluded. Meanwhile, I continued managing my rental properties and working at the bank, building financial security, while watching my son drift away from everything we'd shared. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek was living rent-free in a house I'd purchased as an investment, while treating me like a distant relative whose company was no longer desirable. The breaking point came during their second year of marriage, when Derek called with news that seemed designed to distance us even further. Vanessa was pregnant, he announced, and they were preparing to start their family in earnest. The Hampton grandparents-to-be were already making plans for the nursery, discussing private schools, and setting up trust funds that would ensure their grandchild's privileged future. I congratulated Derek enthusiastically and asked about visiting schedules, hoping that becoming a grandmother might restore some closeness to our relationship. Instead, Derek explained that Vanessa's parents would be the primary grandparents, given their resources and availability. Catherine had already quit her charity work to prepare for full-time grandmother duties, and Richard was planning to involve the child in family business activities from an early age. As for me, Derek suggested that occasional visits would be appropriate, but that Vanessa preferred a quiet household during her pregnancy and would need space to bond with the baby after delivery. He spoke as if my role as grandmother was a minor supporting part in a play where the Hampton family held all the starring roles. That conversation marked the beginning of the end of my patience with Derek's transformation into someone I barely recognized. The son I'd raised to value family, hard work, and loyalty had become someone who measured relationships by social status and financial advantage. He'd forgotten where he came from, and more importantly, he'd forgotten who had made his comfortable lifestyle possible. The final insult came 6 months later, when Derek called with what he presented as wonderful news. Vanessa's parents had decided to spend more time in Portland to be closer to their expected grandchild. They were planning to sell their vacation home in Bend and purchase a property in the city where they could stay for extended visits. Derek's house, my house, would be perfect for their needs, he explained. and they were prepared to make a generous offer to purchase it immediately. The assumption that I would sell my investment property to accommodate his in-laws' convenience was breathtaking in its presumptuousness. Derek had never asked about my ownership of the house, never questioned why he'd been living there rent-free, and apparently never considered that his living situation was a gift rather than an entitlement. Now he was asking me to give up a valuable asset so that his wealthy in-laws could have a comfortable place to stay during their visits. When I explained that the house wasn't for sale and that I'd purchased it as a long-term investment, Derek seemed genuinely shocked. He'd been living there so long that he'd apparently convinced himself it belonged to him, or at least that his right to occupy it was permanent and unconditional. The idea that I might have my own financial plans and investment strategies seemed to have never occurred to him. Our conversation grew heated as Derek argued that selling the house would be good for everyone involved. The Hampton family would pay above market value, he claimed, and I could use the money to purchase a smaller property that would be more appropriate for someone my age. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor by arranging the sale, rather than asking me to sacrifice my financial interests for his convenience. When I refused to consider selling, Derek's tone shifted from persuasive to demanding. Vanessa was stressed about her parents' housing situation, he said, and their comfort was essential for her health during pregnancy. As her husband, it was his responsibility to solve this problem, and my refusal to help was creating unnecessary family drama. He suggested that I was being selfish by prioritizing my investment goals over his wife's well-being and their unborn child's future. The conversation ended with Derek saying he needed time to think about solutions, but his tone suggested that he considered my refusal temporary and unreasonable. I hung up the phone feeling as if I'd been talking to a stranger who happened to share my son's voice. The Derek I'd raised would never have spoken to me with such entitlement and disrespect, but that Derek seemed to have disappeared entirely. 2 weeks later, Derek arrived at my apartment unannounced, accompanied by Vanessa and her parents. It was clearly a planned intervention designed to pressure me into selling the house, and I felt ambushed by the coordinated effort. They'd brought a folder of documents, property assessments, market comparisons, and a purchase offer that was indeed generous but irrelevant to my decision. Richard Hampton took the lead in the presentation, speaking as if he were addressing a business negotiation rather than a family discussion. He praised my investment instincts in purchasing the property, acknowledged its appreciation in value, and outlined the benefits of selling at what he called the peak of the market cycle. His tone was condescending but patient, as if he were explaining complicated concepts to someone who might not understand them fully. Catherine focused on the family benefits of the arrangement, emphasizing how much easier it would be for them to help with the baby if they had a comfortable place to stay nearby. She spoke about the nursery they would create, the childcare support they would provide, and the advantage of having experienced grandparents available for guidance and assistance. The implication was clear. My role as grandmother would be minimal, compared to their contributions. Vanessa remained largely silent during the presentation, but her presence was part of the pressure tactic. She looked tired and stressed, occasionally touching her growing belly in a gesture that seemed designed to remind everyone of her pregnancy and the importance of accommodating her needs. When she did speak, it was to emphasize how much the housing situation was worrying her and affecting her ability to enjoy her pregnancy. Derek played the role of mediator, acknowledging both sides while clearly advocating for his in-laws' position. He spoke about compromise and family harmony, suggesting that selling the house would demonstrate my commitment to their happiness and the well-being of my future grandchild. He painted my refusal as stubborn and short-sighted, ignoring the fact that he'd been living in my property rent-free for years without ever acknowledging my generosity. I listened to their presentation politely, asked a few questions about their timeline and expectations, and then calmly explained my position. The house was a key component of my retirement planning, I told them, and selling it would significantly impact my financial security. I'd worked hard to build my investment portfolio, and I wasn't prepared to sacrifice my future stability for their convenience. The reaction was immediate and telling. Richard's patient demeanor shifted to barely concealed irritation, as if he weren't accustomed to having his reasonable proposals rejected by people of lesser means. Catherine's smile became tight and forced, and she began asking pointed questions about my other income sources and whether I'd properly considered the tax implications of holding on to rental property. Derek grew visibly frustrated as it became clear that I wouldn't be swayed by their arguments. He accused me of being inflexible and short-sighted, suggesting that I was prioritizing money over family relationships. When I pointed out that I'd been supporting his living situation for years without compensation, he dismissed it as irrelevant to the current discussion. The meeting ended with Richard Hampton suggesting that I take time to reconsider their offer, as if my decision were based on insufficient reflection rather than legitimate financial concerns. Catherine mentioned that they'd need to make alternative arrangements if I remained unwilling to sell, speaking as if my refusal would create significant hardship for their family. Derek said he hoped I'd change my mind for everyone's sake, but his tone suggested disappointment rather than understanding. After they left, I sat in my small apartment feeling exhausted and hurt by the encounter. My own son had participated in what felt like a coordinated attack on my financial independence, supporting his in-laws' assumption that I should sacrifice my security for their comfort. The Derek I'd raised would have defended my right to make my own decisions, but that Derek was apparently gone, replaced by someone who valued his new family's approval more than his mother's well-being. The weeks following that uncomfortable meeting settled into an uneasy routine. Derek called less frequently, and when he did, our conversations were strained and superficial. He would ask about my health, mention briefly how Vanessa was feeling, and end the calls quickly without the easy banter we'd once shared. I could sense his frustration simmering beneath the polite surface, but I refused to feel guilty for protecting my financial future. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my work at the bank and focused on managing my rental properties. The other 3 houses in my portfolio were performing well, with reliable tenants and steady income streams. The Eastmoreland property where Derek lived was the only one generating no revenue, but I'd convinced myself that supporting my son was worth the financial sacrifice. That rationalization was becoming harder to maintain as Derek's attitude toward me grew increasingly cold and entitled. 3 weeks after the failed intervention, Derek called with news that initially seemed positive. He'd been promoted to senior marketing manager at his tech company, with a significant salary increase and stock options that could be quite valuable if the startup continued to grow. Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled for his success and proud of his professional achievements. Instead, his announcement felt calculated, as if he were demonstrating his financial independence to justify his position in our ongoing dispute. During that same conversation, Derek mentioned casually that he and Vanessa had started looking at houses in the West Hills, closer to her parents' estate. The properties they were considering were well beyond what his previous salary could have supported. But with his promotion and the Hampton family's financial backing, they were exploring options that would give them more space and privacy for their growing family. I congratulated him on the promotion and expressed interest in hearing about their house hunting, hoping that his plans to move might resolve our conflict naturally. If Derek found a place he preferred, he could move out of my property without either of us having to acknowledge the awkwardness of our situation. The Eastmoreland house could return to its intended purpose as a rental property, and I could start generating income from it again. Derek's response surprised me with its coldness. He explained that moving would be expensive and complicated, especially with Vanessa's pregnancy advancing. The timing wasn't ideal for house hunting, mortgage applications, and the stress of relocating. Besides, he'd grown attached to the Eastmoreland house and considered it his home in every meaningful sense. The suggestion that he might move seemed to irritate him, as if I were trying to push him out of a place where he belonged. I realized then that Derek had no intention of moving voluntarily. In his mind, the house had become his permanent residence, and my ownership was merely a technical detail that shouldn't affect his right to live there indefinitely. He'd spent 5 years treating the property as his own, making minor improvements and modifications without consulting me, and apparently believing that his occupation gave him some kind of permanent claim to the space. The conversation took a darker turn when Derek began discussing his vision for the house's future. He and Vanessa were planning to convert the spare bedroom into a nursery, he explained, and they'd already spoken with contractors about adding a deck off the back of the house where they could entertain guests and eventually watch their children play in the yard. These weren't temporary modifications for renters. They were the long-term improvements of homeowners who expected to stay indefinitely. When I gently pointed out that any major renovations would need my approval as the property owner, Derek's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. He accused me of being petty and controlling, suggesting that my concerns about property modifications were just another way of asserting dominance in our relationship. He claimed that normal parents would be thrilled to see their children settling down and making homes for themselves, rather than treating them like temporary tenants with no rights or security. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be painful. Part of me did want to see Derek happy and settled, creating a home where I could visit my future grandchild and maintain our family connection. But his assumption that I should sacrifice my financial interests for his domestic dreams felt presumptuous and unfair. I'd worked too hard building my investment portfolio to give it away, even to my own son. Our relationship continued to deteriorate over the following months as Derek's resentment grew more obvious. He began making pointed comments about landlords who prioritized profit over people, sharing articles on social media about housing affordability and the greed of property investors. The irony was bitter. My son was using progressive talking points about housing justice to criticize the mother who'd provided him with free housing for years. Vanessa's pregnancy progressed, and the Hampton family's involvement in Derek's life intensified accordingly. Catherine Hampton had appointed herself as the primary pregnancy advisor, accompanying Vanessa to doctor appointments, planning baby showers, and making decisions about everything from prenatal vitamins to nursery themes. Richard Hampton was already discussing college savings plans and trust fund arrangements for his future grandchild, treating the baby's financial future as his personal responsibility. My own role in the pregnancy felt increasingly marginal. Derek would share updates about Vanessa's health in our brief phone conversations, but always in the context of what the Hampton family was doing to help and support them. When I offered to attend doctor appointments or help with baby preparations, Derek politely declined, explaining that they already had more support than they could handle and didn't want to overwhelm Vanessa with too many people involved. The baby shower was particularly painful. Catherine Hampton organized an elaborate event at their country club, complete with professional decorations, catered food, and games that seemed designed more for social media photos than genuine celebration. I received an invitation, but it felt more like an obligation than a welcome, and the timing coincided with a work commitment I couldn't reschedule. When I called Derek to explain that I might be late to the shower due to a loan closing that had been delayed, his response was telling. Instead of disappointment or concern about my absence, he seemed relieved. He suggested that maybe it would be better if I didn't stress myself trying to make it, since there would be so many people there, and Vanessa was feeling overwhelmed by all the attention. The message was clear. My presence wasn't essential, and my absence might actually be preferred. I attended the shower anyway, arriving an hour late and feeling immediately out of place among the assembled guests. The Hampton family's social circle was well represented, with women who discussed their children's private schools, family vacation homes, and charity work with casual confidence. Conversations flowed around topics I had no experience with, and I found myself standing alone more often than not, watching Derek and Vanessa open expensive gifts while receiving congratulations from people who clearly belonged to their preferred social circle. My own gift, A handmade baby blanket that had taken me weeks to knit seemed modest and out of place among the designer strollers, high-tech monitors, and luxury baby clothes that filled the gift table. When Vanessa opened it, she smiled politely and thanked me briefly before moving on to the next present without comment. The blanket disappeared into the pile of gifts, and I wondered if it would ever actually be used for my grandchild. During the shower, I overheard Catherine Hampton discussing plans for the nursery with several other guests. She described the custom furniture they'd ordered, the professional decorator they'd hired, and the educational toys that would stimulate the baby's development from birth. When one guest asked about the baby's other grandmother's involvement, Catherine's response was diplomatically dismissive. She explained that different families had different resources and traditions, and they were grateful to be in a position to provide everything the baby would need. The implicit message was that my contributions weren't necessary or particularly welcome. The Hampton family had claimed primary responsibility for their grandchild's upbringing, and my role would be limited to whatever small space they chose to allow me. I was being systematically excluded from my own grandchild's life before the baby was even born, and Derek seemed not only comfortable with this arrangement, but actively supportive of it. As Vanessa's due date approached, the pressure surrounding the housing situation intensified. Richard Hampton began making comments about the inconvenience of staying in hotels during extended visits to help with the baby, and Catherine mentioned repeatedly how much easier it would be to provide childcare support if they had a permanent place to stay nearby. Derek echoed their concerns, emphasizing how much stress the uncertain housing situation was causing Vanessa during the final weeks of her pregnancy. The manipulation was transparent but effective. They were using Vanessa's pregnancy and my future grandchild as leverage to pressure me into selling my property, betting that my desire to be involved in the baby's life would overcome my financial concerns. The strategy might have worked if they'd approached me with respect and genuine consideration for my position. But their entitled demands and dismissive attitude had the opposite effect. I found myself becoming more determined to maintain control of my property, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. If I capitulated to their pressure tactics now, I would be establishing a pattern of submission that would define our relationship for years to come. Every future decision about my grandchild's life would be subject to Hampton family approval, and my own wishes and boundaries would be irrelevant. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, when Derek arrived at my apartment without warning, looking more stressed and agitated than I'd ever seen him. Vanessa was in her final month of pregnancy, he explained, and the nesting instinct had kicked in with a vengeance. She was obsessing about having everything perfect for the baby's arrival, and the uncertainty about her parents' housing situation was causing her anxiety that her doctor was concerned might affect the pregnancy. Derek's approach was different this time, less demanding and more pleading. He spoke about his responsibility as a husband and father to provide security and stability for his family. He talked about the sleepless nights Vanessa was experiencing, worrying about logistics and planning while trying to prepare for motherhood. He painted a picture of a stressed pregnant woman whose health and happiness depended on resolving the housing situation immediately. When emotional appeals didn't work, Derek shifted to practical arguments. The real estate market was at its peak, he claimed, and waiting longer to sell would mean missing the optimal opportunity for maximum profit. He'd done research on comparable properties and believed the Hampton family's offer was not only fair but generous. He suggested that I was being short-sighted by focusing on rental income when a lump sum payment could be invested more profitably elsewhere. I listened to his presentation calmly, recognizing the desperation behind his arguments. Derek was caught between his wife's family's expectations and his mother's refusal to comply, and the pressure was clearly affecting him. Part of me felt sympathy for his difficult position, but a larger part resented being blamed for a conflict I hadn't created. When Derek finished his appeal, I asked him a simple question that seemed to catch him off guard. I wanted to know when. He planned to start paying rent for the house he'd been living in rent-free for 5 years. The question hung in the air between us. exposing the fundamental assumption that had been driving our entire conflict. Derek's response revealed the depth of his entitlement. He claimed that family members shouldn't charge each other rent, that his occupation of the house was a mutually beneficial arrangement, and that asking for payment would change the nature of our relationship in ways that couldn't be undone. He spoke as if paying rent would be an insult to our family bond, rather than a normal expectation for someone occupying someone else's property. I pointed out that his in-laws were essentially asking me to give them a free house by selling at their convenience, which was a much larger financial gift than asking for market-rate rent. Derek dismissed this comparison, arguing that a sale would benefit everyone involved while charging rent would only create ongoing tension and resentment between us. The conversation grew heated as Derek's frustration boiled over. He accused me of being greedy and selfish, prioritizing money over family relationships and my future grandchild's well-being. He suggested that I was jealous of the Hampton family's success and taking out my resentment on Vanessa and the baby. He claimed that normal grandmothers would be thrilled to help their children succeed, rather than creating obstacles and drama during such an important time in their lives. Each accusation felt like a slap, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little Derek understood about my motivations and sacrifices. The son I'd raised to value hard work and family loyalty was now using those same values against me, twisting them into weapons designed to guilt me into submission. He'd learned to speak the Hampton family's language of entitlement and manipulation, and he was using it against the person who'd given him everything. I tried to explain my position one more time, emphasizing that my rental properties were my retirement plan and my financial security. I reminded Derek that I'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, that I'd supported his living situation for years without complaint, and that I deserved to have my own financial future respected and protected. I told him that I loved him and wanted to be part of my grandchild's life, but not at the cost of my independence and security. Derek's response was the final blow to our relationship. He told me that if I truly cared about him and his family, I would find a way to make the sale work. He said that Vanessa's parents were generous, successful people who had offered to welcome me into their extended family, and my refusal to cooperate was embarrassing him and damaging his marriage. He suggested that I was being stubborn and unreasonable, clinging to properties I didn't really need while his growing family faced genuine hardship. The conversation ended with Derek storming out of my apartment, leaving me alone with the echo of his accusations and the growing certainty that our relationship had been fundamentally damaged. My son had chosen his new family's interests over our bond, and he'd done so with a sense of righteousness that made reconciliation seem impossible. Over the following days, I received several calls from Derek that I let go to voicemail. His messages started conciliatory, apologizing for losing his temper and asking if we could meet to discuss the situation more calmly. When I didn't return his calls immediately, the tone shifted to concern about Vanessa's stress levels and the approaching due date. By the end of the week, his messages had become demanding, insisting that I call him back and accusing me of being petty and vindictive. I finally returned his call on a Sunday evening, hoping that some time and distance might have given us both perspective on our conflict. Instead, Derek immediately launched into a renewed argument about the housing situation, as if our previous conversation had only reinforced his conviction that I was being unreasonable. He told me that Vanessa had been having contractions and her doctor was monitoring her closely for signs of preterm labor brought on by stress. The implication was clear. If anything happened to the baby, it would be my fault for refusing to accommodate the Hampton family's housing needs. Derek was weaponizing his wife's pregnancy against me, using my concern for my grandchild to manipulate me into compliance. The tactic was emotionally devastating and ethically reprehensible, and it marked the point where I stopped seeing Derek as the son I'd raised and started seeing him as an adversary who would use any means necessary to get what he wanted. I told Derek calmly that I hoped Vanessa and the baby would be healthy, but that her medical condition didn't change my position on the property sale. I suggested that if housing was such a critical issue, perhaps he should consider paying rent, like any other tenant, which would provide him with legal protections and demonstrate his commitment to the arrangement. I reminded him that most landlords charged market rates for properties in desirable neighborhoods, and that family relationships didn't typically include free housing indefinitely. Derek's response was explosive. He accused me of trying to profit from his family's vulnerability, of treating him like a stranger rather than a son, and of caring more about money than relationships. He said that charging rent would fundamentally change our dynamic and make him feel like he was being exploited by his own mother. He claimed that the Hampton family was shocked by my mercenary attitude and questioning whether they wanted someone with my values involved in their grandchild's life. The threat was explicit: comply with their demands or risk being cut off from my grandchild entirely. Derek was using access to the baby as a bargaining chip, betting that my desire to be a grandmother would override my principles and financial concerns. It was the kind of manipulation I'd seen from abusive partners in domestic violence cases at the bank, and recognizing the pattern in my own son's behavior was heartbreaking. I ended the call by telling Derek that I needed time to think about our conversation, but my mind was already made up. I would not be bullied or manipulated into sacrificing my financial security, regardless of the emotional consequences. If Derek wanted to live in my property, he could pay rent like any other tenant. If he wanted to cut me out of his life for asserting reasonable boundaries, that was his choice to make. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Patricia Kim, and scheduled an appointment to discuss my options as a landlord dealing with a non-paying tenant who happened to be my son. Patricia had handled the legal work for my property acquisitions over the years, and she understood both my business interests and the complicated family dynamics involved in the situation. Patricia's advice was straightforward from a legal perspective. Derek had been living in my property without a lease agreement or any formal documentation of his tenancy. While Oregon's tenant protection laws would require proper notice for eviction, his lack of legal standing as a tenant would make the process relatively simple. She could draft a notice requiring him to begin paying market-rate rent or vacate the property within 30 days, giving him the choice between becoming a legitimate tenant or finding alternative housing. From a personal perspective, Patricia warned me that pursuing legal action against my own son would likely destroy our relationship permanently. Derek would see it as the ultimate betrayal, she explained, and the Hampton family would use it as evidence of my unreasonable and vindictive character. I would win the legal battle but lose any chance of reconciliation with my son or involvement in my grandchild's life. I understood the risks, but I also understood that Derek had already made his choice about our relationship. He'd chosen his new family's approval over our bond, their financial interests over mine, and their social status over the values I'd taught him. The Derek who would have respected my position and appreciated my sacrifices was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I asked Patricia to prepare the legal notice, but to hold off on serving it until after Vanessa gave birth. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want to add legal stress to an already complicated pregnancy. I would give Derek one final opportunity to voluntarily begin paying rent or discuss moving out, and only pursue formal eviction if he continued to refuse reasonable terms. The baby arrived 3 weeks later, a healthy daughter they named Isabella Rose. Derek called to share the news, his voice filled with joy and exhaustion as he described the delivery and the baby's perfect features. For a moment, hearing about my granddaughter's arrival, I forgot about our conflict and felt only pride and happiness for this new addition to our family. Derek seemed to soften as well during that phone call, perhaps influenced by the emotional intensity of becoming a father. He thanked me for being patient during Vanessa's difficult pregnancy and expressed hope that we could work things out for Isabella's sake. He said he wanted his daughter to know her grandmother and to benefit from the wisdom and love that had shaped his own childhood. I was cautiously optimistic that fatherhood might restore some of Derek's better instincts and help him remember the values that had once defined our relationship. New parents often gain perspective on their own upbringing and develop greater appreciation for the sacrifices their parents made. I hoped that holding his daughter might remind Derek of who he used to be before the Hampton family's influence changed him. My optimism lasted exactly 5 days. Derek called again, this time with news that shattered any hope of reconciliation. The Hampton family had decided to purchase a house for Derek and Vanessa as a baby gift, he announced, and they would be moving within the month. The house was in the West Hills, walking distance from the Hampton estate, with 4 bedrooms and a large yard where Isabella could grow up surrounded by her extended family. Initially, this seemed like the perfect solution to our housing conflict. Derek would move out of my property voluntarily, allowing me to rent it to paying tenants without any family drama. He would have the security and status of home ownership, backed by his in-laws' financial resources, and I would regain control of my investment property. It appeared to be a win-win situation that would resolve our dispute without legal action. But Derek wasn't finished with his announcement. The Hampton family's generosity came with conditions, he explained, and one of those conditions involved my property. They were concerned about Derek's previous living arrangement and the precedent it might set for their daughter's expectations about family financial support. They wanted a clean break from any ongoing obligations or entanglements that might complicate Derek's new status as a homeowner. What Derek was telling me, in carefully diplomatic language, was that the Hampton family wanted him to formally end his occupancy of my property before they finalized their gift. They didn't want their daughter married to someone who might be seen as dependent on his mother's charity, and they were uncomfortable with the idea that I retained any kind of leverage over Derek's housing situation. The solution they'd devised was elegant in its cruelty. Derek would move out of my property immediately, before the closing on his new house was complete. He would stay with the Hampton family during the transition period, which might last several weeks while final inspections, appraisals, and paperwork were completed. This arrangement would demonstrate his independence from me while ensuring that Vanessa and the baby were comfortable and well supported during the move. I should have been relieved that Derek was finally leaving my property, but something about the arrangement felt deliberately punitive. The Hampton family was forcing Derek to choose between their support and any ongoing connection to me, and Derek was making that choice without apparent hesitation. He was cutting ties with his old life completely in order to fully embrace his new one. When I asked Derek about the timing and logistics of his move, his responses confirmed my suspicions about the Hampton family's motives. They wanted him out of my house immediately, he explained, because having him as a tenant might complicate their daughter's social standing. The wives in Catherine Hampton's social circle were already gossiping about Derek's background and financial dependence, and they didn't want to give anyone additional ammunition for criticism. The conversation that should have been about practical moving arrangements became another lecture about social expectations and family obligations. Derek explained that Vanessa was embarrassed by the questions her friends asked about our family's financial dynamics, and that Catherine had been forced to make excuses for Derek's unconventional living situation at social gatherings. By moving out immediately and cutting financial ties with me, Derek would demonstrate his independence and worthiness of inclusion in their social circle. I realized then that this wasn't just about housing. It was about erasing me from Derek's new life entirely. The Hampton family saw me as a liability to their daughter's marriage and their grandchild's upbringing, and they were systematically removing my influence and presence from Derek's world. By the time they were finished, I would be nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of Derek's modest origins, someone to be acknowledged politely at major holidays and otherwise ignored. The final insult came when Derek mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he would need me to return his security deposit when he moved out. The request was so absurd that I initially thought he was joking. Derek had never paid a security deposit because he'd never been a formal tenant. He'd been living in my property as my son, not as a renter, and the entire arrangement had been based on family relationships rather than landlord-tenant agreements. When I pointed this out, Derek's response revealed the depth of his delusion. about our arrangement. He claimed that his occupation of the house had been a business transaction from the beginning, with implied agreements about rent, maintenance responsibilities, and tenant rights that I'd never actually established. He argued that his improvements to the property had been made with the understanding that he was investing in his own living situation, not providing free labor to increase my property value. Derek had rewritten the history of our housing arrangement to cast himself as a tenant who'd been fulfilling his obligations rather than a son who'd been receiving free housing for years. In his revised version of events, I was a landlord who owed him the courtesy and protections that paying tenants deserved, rather than a mother who'd been subsidizing his lifestyle out of love and generosity. The conversation ended with Derek demanding that I provide written documentation of his tenancy rights and deposit refund, threatening to involve lawyers if I didn't comply with proper landlord procedures. He spoke as if he were consulting a legal advice website rather than talking to his mother, using formal language about lease agreements and tenant protections that had never applied to our informal arrangement. I hung up the phone feeling as if I'd been talking to a stranger who was impersonating my son. The Derek I'd raised would never have spoken to me with such calculated hostility, using legal threats and false claims to extract concessions from someone who'd only tried to help him. The Hampton family had completed their transformation of my son into someone I no longer recognized or respected. That night, I called Patricia Kim and asked her to prepare the eviction notice immediately. I was finished trying to reason with Derek or accommodate his increasingly outrageous demands. If he wanted to treat our family relationship as a business transaction, I would give him exactly what he was asking for: a formal, legal resolution to his occupancy of my property. The notice was served the following Tuesday, delivered by a process server to ensure proper legal documentation. Derek had 30 days to begin paying market rate rent of $2,800 per month or vacate the property entirely. The document was formal, precise, and absolutely binding under Oregon state law. Derek's response came within hours, delivered via text message in language that would have made his Hampton in-laws proud. He accused me of betraying our family bond, exploiting legal technicalities to harm my own son, and prioritizing money over relationships in ways that would damage our family for generations. He claimed that he'd been a model tenant who'd maintained the property beautifully, and that my sudden demand for rent was vindictive and unreasonable. The irony was perfect. Derek was simultaneously claiming that he'd been a legitimate tenant, with rights and protections, while also arguing that charging rent would destroy our family relationship. He wanted the benefits of both arrangements, the legal protections of a tenant and the emotional immunity of a son, without accepting the responsibilities that came with either role. His final text message was the most revealing of all. Derek informed me that he would be moving out immediately, not because he was required to by the eviction notice, but because he refused to live in a property owned by someone who would treat family members like business transactions. He was recasting his forced departure as a principled decision, maintaining his dignity while complying with legal requirements he couldn't fight. Within a week, Derek had moved all of his belongings out of the house and into temporary storage, while he waited for his new home's closing to be completed. He left no forwarding address, no contact information, and no indication of when or if he planned to speak to me again. The house was left clean but impersonal, stripped of any evidence that my son had lived there for 5 years. I walked through the empty rooms feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness. The property could finally fulfill its intended purpose as a rental investment, generating income that would support my retirement planning. But the cost of that victory was the relationship with my son and the loss of any meaningful connection to my granddaughter's life. The Hampton family had achieved their objective. Derek was completely severed from his old life and fully dependent on their support and approval. I had achieved mine as well, control of my property and protection of my financial interests. But neither victory felt particularly satisfying as I stood alone in the house where my son had taken his first steps toward becoming someone I could no longer recognize or respect. The silence that filled my life after Derek moved out was both liberating and devastating. For the first time in 5 years, I could make decisions about the Eastmoreland property without considering anyone else's feelings or needs. I could list it for rent at market rate, screen potential tenants properly, and start generating the income I'd always intended. But the freedom came at a cost I hadn't fully anticipated: the complete loss of my relationship with my son and the knowledge that I might never have a meaningful connection with my granddaughter. I spent the first week after Derek's departure cleaning and preparing the house for rental. The task was both practical and therapeutic, allowing me to reclaim the space while processing the emotional aftermath of our conflict. Derek had left. The house in good condition, but it needed fresh paint, carpet cleaning, and minor repairs to make it attractive to potential renters. Each room I worked on felt like reclaiming territory that had been occupied by someone who no longer felt like family. The nursery Derek had planned to create remained an empty bedroom with pale yellow walls and a single window overlooking the backyard. Standing in that room, I thought about the grandchild I might never know, the bedtime stories I might never read, and the family traditions that would die with me because Derek had chosen his new life over our shared history. The loss felt overwhelming, but I pushed through it by focusing on practical tasks and future plans. Within 2 weeks, I had the house listed with a reputable property management company that specialized in high-end rentals. The Eastmoreland neighborhood was in high demand, and the house's updated features and excellent location made it attractive to young professionals and small families. I received 3 applications within the first week, all from qualified tenants who could afford the rent and had excellent references. I selected a young couple, both doctors completing their residencies at Oregon Health and Science University. They were responsible, respectful, and genuinely excited about the house and neighborhood. Signing their lease agreement felt like a small victory, proof that I could successfully manage my properties without family complications or emotional entanglements. The monthly rent they would pay exceeded my mortgage payment by enough to provide significant income while building equity for my retirement. My work at the bank provided welcome distraction from the family drama. I'd been promoted to assistant branch manager the previous year, and the increased responsibilities kept me busy with staff supervision, complex loan applications, and customer relationship management. My colleagues knew about Derek's situation, only in general terms, that my son had moved out of my rental property and we were having some family difficulties. They respected my privacy and didn't pry into details I wasn't prepared to share. The real estate market was performing well, and several of my longtime clients were refinancing their mortgages or purchasing investment properties. My experience as both a banker and property investor made me valuable to customers who wanted guidance on real estate decisions, and I found satisfaction in helping other people achieve their financial goals even as my personal life felt increasingly isolated. One afternoon in late November, I received an unexpected call from Tom Chen, a property management consultant I'd worked with years earlier when I was first building my rental portfolio. Tom had helped me evaluate potential investments and learn the business side of being a landlord, and we'd maintained a professional friendship even after I'd become experienced enough to manage my properties independently. Tom had heard through mutual contacts that I was dealing with some family complications related to one of my rental properties, and he wanted to check in and offer support. His call was perfectly timed. I needed someone to talk to who understood both the business and emotional aspects of property management, and Tom had always been a good listener with practical advice. We met for coffee at a quiet cafe in Southeast Portland, away from my usual haunts where I might encounter people who knew Derek or the Hampton family. Tom listened patiently as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting me tell the story without interruption. His expression grew increasingly concerned as I described Derek's transformation and the Hampton family's manipulative tactics. When I finished, Tom was quiet for a long moment before responding. He'd seen similar situations before, he told me, where family members took advantage of relatives in the real estate business. The emotional manipulation, the sense of entitlement, and the assumption that family relationships trumped business considerations were all common patterns he'd observed over the years. What struck Tom most was Derek's complete lack of appreciation for the financial gift I'd been giving him. Free housing in a desirable neighborhood for 5 years represented tens of thousands of dollars in value, he calculated, and Derek's assumption that this generosity would continue indefinitely showed a fundamental misunderstanding of both family relationships and business principles. Tom also pointed out something I'd been too close to the situation to see clearly. Derek's behavior wasn't just about housing, it was about control. The Hampton family had systematically isolated him from his previous support systems and made him dependent on their approval and resources. By cutting ties with me, Derek was demonstrating his complete loyalty to his new family and their values, even at the cost of his relationship with the person who'd raised him. The conversation with Tom helped me gain perspective on the situation and feel less guilty about my decision to evict Derek. I'd been questioning whether I'd been too harsh or inflexible, wondering if there might have been some compromise that could have preserved our relationship while protecting my interests. Tom assured me that I'd handled the situation appropriately and that Derek's response revealed his true character rather than any failure on my part. As winter settled over, Portland, I established new routines that didn't include Derek or his family. I volunteered at the local food bank on weekends, joined a book club at the library, and started taking evening classes in Spanish to reconnect with my cultural heritage. The activities helped fill time that had previously been occupied by family obligations and provided opportunities to meet people who appreciated my company without any ulterior motives. The rental income from the Eastmoreland house was performing exactly as I'd projected, providing steady monthly cash flow that I invested in additional properties and retirement accounts. My other 3 rental properties were also performing well, with reliable tenants and minimal maintenance issues. For the first time in years, I felt confident about my financial future and proud of the investment portfolio I'd built through careful planning and hard work. Christmas approached with a mixture of sadness and relief. I wouldn't have to navigate the complicated dynamics of Hampton family gatherings or watch Derek prioritize his in-laws over our traditions. Instead, I spent the holiday with my brother's family in California, enjoying simple pleasures like cooking together, playing games with my nieces and nephews, and attending midnight mass at their local church. My brother Carlos had always been supportive of my real estate investments and understood the challenges of building financial security as a single parent. When I told him about Derek's situation, he wasn't entirely surprised. He'd noticed Derek's changing attitude during previous visits and had commented privately to me that success seemed to be going to Derek's head. Carlos's wife, Maria, was more direct in her assessment. She thought Derek had been influenced by people who didn't share our family's values, and that his behavior was shameful. Their support meant more to me than they probably realized. For months, I'd been questioning my own judgment and wondering if I'd been too rigid in my expectations or too quick to assume the worst about Derek's motivations. Having family members who understood my perspective and validated my decisions helped me feel less isolated and more confident in my choices. The new year brought unexpected developments that would change everything. In January, I received a call from Patricia Kim, my lawyer, with news that surprised both of us. Derek had contacted her office requesting copies of property records and lease agreements related to his previous occupancy of my house. He claimed he needed the documentation for tax purposes, but Patricia suspected he was building a case for some kind of legal action against me. The request was legally frivolous. Derek had no standing to challenge my ownership of the property or the terms of his eviction, but Patricia warned me that frivolous lawsuits could still be expensive and time-consuming to defend, especially if Derek had access to the Hampton family's legal resources. She recommended that I document everything related to our housing arrangement and prepare for the possibility that Derek might try to claim tenant rights or damages he wasn't entitled to. I spent several days gathering documentation, purchase records, tax filings, insurance policies, and maintenance receipts that proved my ownership and investment in the property. The paperwork told the story of a responsible landlord who'd maintained her property properly and provided free housing to a family member for years. If Derek wanted to turn our family conflict into a legal battle, I was prepared to defend myself, with facts and documentation. The legal threat never materialized, but the attempt to intimidate me revealed how completely Derek had embraced the Hampton family's approach to conflict resolution. Instead of addressing our disagreement directly or attempting reconciliation, he was exploring ways to use the legal system to extract concessions or punish me for asserting my rights. The Derek I'd raised would never have considered such tactics, but that Derek seemed to be permanently gone. In February, I encountered Vanessa Hampton at a grocery store in southeast Portland, far from her usual shopping haunts in the West Hills. She was pushing a cart with baby Isabella, who was now about 4 months old and absolutely beautiful. For a moment, I considered approaching them. Isabella was my granddaughter, and I hadn't seen her since the day she was born. But something in Vanessa's expression when she spotted me made me reconsider. She looked uncomfortable and slightly fearful, as if she were expecting confrontation or unpleasantness. She quickly turned her cart toward a different aisle, clearly trying to avoid any interaction. The message was unmistakable. I was no longer welcome in their lives, and even casual encounters were to be avoided. Watching my granddaughter disappear around the corner of the cereal aisle felt like a physical blow. Isabella was a beautiful baby with Derek's dark hair and what looked like my mother's eyes. She would grow up without knowing me, without learning about her Salvadoran heritage, and without benefiting from the wisdom and love I'd hoped to share with her. The Hampton family had succeeded in erasing me from her life before she was old, enough to remember that I existed. Spring arrived with a mix of renewal and melancholy. The tenants in the Eastmoreland house were excellent. They paid rent on time, maintained the property well, and had already expressed interest in renewing their lease for another year. My other rental properties were also performing consistently, and I'd been able to purchase a 5th property in the Alberta district that was appreciating rapidly as the neighborhood continued to gentrify. My work at the bank had evolved into new responsibilities that kept me engaged and challenged. I'd been selected to join a community development committee that worked with first-time homebuyers and small business owners seeking commercial loans. The work was meaningful and allowed me to use my experience to help other people achieve financial stability and build wealth through real estate investment. One afternoon in May, I received a call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Marcus Johnson, Derek's former college roommate who'd stayed in touch with him over the years. Marcus had heard about our family conflict through mutual friends and wanted to meet with me to discuss the situation. He had information about Derek's marriage and the Hampton family's influence that he thought I should know. We met at Powell's Books Cafe, a neutral location where we could talk privately without attracting attention. Marcus was a thoughtful, young man who'd known Derek well during college and had remained close to him until recently. He'd been concerned about changes in Derek's personality and behavior since the marriage, and he'd tried to maintain their friendship despite Derek's increasing distance from his old friends and interests. Marcus's story filled in details about Derek's transformation that I hadn't fully understood. The Hampton family had systematically isolated Derek from his previous social circle, gradually convincing him that his old friends were holding him back and that success required embracing new values and priorities. They'd replaced his old interests with activities that aligned with their social circle, and they'd made it clear that maintaining relationships with people from his past would be seen as a lack of commitment to his new life. The manipulation had been subtle, but effective. Catherine Hampton had made comments about Derek's friends being unmotivated or lacking ambition, while Richard had suggested that successful people associated with other successful people. They'd gradually filled Derek's social calendar with events and obligations that left no time for previous relationships, and they'd made it clear that Vanessa's comfort and happiness depended on Derek's complete integration into their family and social circle. Marcus had watched Derek become increasingly uncomfortable with his own background and family history. Derek had started making disparaging comments about his childhood, characterizing his upbringing as disadvantaged and his mother as someone who didn't understand success or sophisticated social dynamics. He'd begun to see his modest origins as embarrassing rather than character building, and he'd started to distance himself from anything that reminded him of his previous life. The most troubling revelation was that Derek had been actively complaining about me to his new social circle, portraying me as a controlling and unreasonable landlord who was trying to exploit his family situation for financial gain. He'd described our housing arrangement as a business transaction that had gone wrong, rather than acknowledging the generosity I'd shown him for years. The Hampton family had encouraged this narrative because it supported their characterization of Derek as someone who'd overcome difficult circumstances through hard work and their support. Marcus had tried to defend me in these conversations, pointing out that Derek had lived rent-free for years and that requesting payment was hardly unreasonable. But Derek had become hostile to any suggestion that he owed me gratitude or consideration, and he'd eventually stopped including Marcus in social activities where such conversations might occur. The conversation with Marcus confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Derek had been completely transformed by the Hampton family's influence, and that transformation included a fundamental rejection of his previous life and relationships. I wasn't just losing my son to his new family. I was being actively vilified and erased from his personal narrative to make his new identity more comfortable and sustainable. Marcus also shared information about Derek's current situation that was both satisfying and concerning. The Hampton family's generosity had come with strings attached that were becoming increasingly burdensome. Derek was expected to attend family, functions, and social events multiple times per week, leaving little time for his own interests or career development. Richard Hampton had strong opinions about Derek's career path and was pressuring him to leave his tech startup for a more traditional position at a financial services firm. Vanessa had developed postpartum depression that was being treated with a combination of medication and therapy, but she was struggling with the demands of new motherhood and the pressure to maintain the Hampton family's social obligations. Catherine Hampton had taken over much of Isabella's care, making decisions about everything from feeding schedules to sleep training methods that left Vanessa feeling inadequate and overwhelmed. Derek was caught between his wife's emotional needs and his in-laws' expectations, trying to fulfill both without having the emotional resources or support systems to handle either effectively. His old friends had been replaced by the Hampton family's social circle, but those relationships were based on social utility rather than genuine affection or shared interests. He was increasingly isolated within his new life, dependent on people who saw him as a project rather than truly accepting him as family. The information Marcus shared helped me understand that Derek was paying a price for his choices, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. The Hampton family's control was absolute, and Derek's compliance with their expectations was becoming more demanding and less rewarding over time. He'd traded his independence and family relationships for social status and financial security, but the cost was his autonomy and authentic connections. As summer approached, I found myself thinking less about Derek and more about my own future. The real estate market was strong, my rental properties were performing well, and I was building wealth at a pace that would allow for comfortable retirement within the next decade. I'd started dating someone, a divorced engineer named Frank, who shared my interests in hiking and Spanish language learning, and our relationship was developing slowly and comfortably without any of the drama that had characterized my family life. Frank knew about Derek's situation, but didn't judge me for the conflict or try to convince me to reconcile with my son. He understood that some relationships become toxic and that protecting your own well-being sometimes requires difficult choices. His support was quiet and steady, based on respect for my judgment rather than assumptions about how family relationships should work. The anniversary of Derek's eviction passed without acknowledgement from either of us. I'd successfully rented the Eastmoreland house to excellent tenants who treated the property with respect and paid their rent reliably. The arrangement was exactly what I'd intended when I first purchased the property. A professional relationship based on mutual respect and clear expectations. The contrast with Derek's occupancy was stark and affirming. One evening in late August, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-protection. The caller was Catherine Hampton, Derek's mother-in-law, and her voice carried a tone of authority that suggested she was accustomed to having her calls returned promptly, and her requests fulfilled without question. Catherine explained that she was calling to discuss Isabella's upcoming first birthday party, which would be held at the Hampton estate in October. She'd been planning the event for months, she said, and it would be a significant celebration, with family and friends. The guest list was carefully curated to include people who would be meaningful influences in Isabella's life as she grew up. The reason for Catherine's call became clear as she continued speaking. She wanted to invite me to Isabella's birthday party, but she had conditions that would need to be met for my attendance to be appropriate. She understood that there had been some unfortunate misunderstandings between Derek and me, she said, but family occasions were opportunities for healing and reconciliation. She hoped I would be willing to put aside past disagreements for Isabella's sake. The conditions Catherine outlined were designed to humiliate me and establish her authority over any future relationship I might have with my granddaughter. I would need to acknowledge that the housing situation had been resolved appropriately, she explained, and that Derek had made the right decision to establish his independence. I would need to commit to being a supportive presence in Isabella's life, without creating conflict or drama that might upset Vanessa or interfere with the family's stability. Most importantly, Catherine continued, I would need to understand that Isabella's upbringing would be guided by Hampton family values and traditions. They wanted to ensure that all influences in Isabella's life were positive and constructive, and they hoped I would respect their parenting decisions and support their approach to child rearing. Any disagreement or criticism of their methods would be seen as disruptive and inappropriate. The manipulation was sophisticated and devastating. Catherine was offering me access to my granddaughter in exchange for complete submission to her family's authority and values. I would be allowed to attend Isabella's birthday party and presumably other family events, but only as a peripheral figure who accepted whatever role they chose to assign me. Any assertion of my own rights or opinions would result in immediate exclusion from Isabella's life. I listened to Catherine's proposal without interruption, recognizing the calculated cruelty behind her reasonable tone. She was using my love for Isabella as leverage to extract concessions and apologies that would validate the Hampton family's treatment of me. The offer was designed to make me complicit in my own diminishment, accepting blame for conflicts I hadn't created in exchange for limited access to my grandchild. When Catherine finished speaking, she waited for my response with the confidence of someone who believed her offer was generous and reasonable. She'd given me the opportunity to rejoin Isabella's life on her terms, and she expected gratitude and compliance in return. The silence stretched between us as I considered my options and their consequences. My response was calm, but definitive. I thanked Catherine for thinking of me in relation to Isabella's birthday celebration, but I declined her invitation and her conditions. I explained that I wasn't willing to accept responsibility for conflicts I hadn't created, or to submit to terms that would compromise my dignity and autonomy. I wished Isabella a happy first birthday, and suggested that perhaps future relationships could be built on mutual respect, rather than conditional acceptance. Catherine's reaction was immediate and revealing. She accused me of prioritizing my pride over my granddaughter's well-being, of being selfish and stubborn in ways that would harm Isabella's family relationships. She claimed that my refusal to participate in Isabella's birthday celebration would be seen as abandonment, and that Isabella would grow up knowing that her grandmother had chosen conflict over family harmony. The conversation ended with Catherine's warning that this was my last opportunity to be part of Isabella's life. The Hampton family would not make similar offers in the future, she said, and my refusal to accept their reasonable conditions would be remembered and shared with Isabella when she was old enough to understand family dynamics. I was being given a choice: submit to their authority or accept permanent exclusion from my granddaughter's life. I chose dignity over access, principles over relationship, and self-respect over submission. The decision was painful but necessary, based on hard-won understanding of how manipulation works and what happens when you give in to emotional blackmail. Catherine Hampton and her family had revealed their true nature through their treatment of me, and I refused to validate their behavior by accepting their terms. That night, I wrote a letter to Isabella that I sealed and placed in my safe deposit box. The letter told her about her grandmother's love, her family history, and the values that had shaped her father's childhood before he changed. I explained my decision to step away from her life rather than accept conditions that would have compromised my integrity and set a poor example for her future. I promised that if she ever wanted to know me, I would be waiting with open arms and an open heart. The letter was my insurance policy against the Hampton family's narrative control. If Isabella ever questioned their version of events or wondered about her paternal grandmother, she would have access to my side of the story. The truth would be preserved, even if it took years or decades for her to discover it. As autumn settled over Portland, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned about family, loyalty, and self-respect. Derek had made his choice to prioritize his new family's approval over our relationship, and I had made mine to protect my dignity and financial security rather than submit to manipulation. Neither choice was easy, but both were necessary for our respective futures. The house in Eastmoreland continued to generate steady rental income, managed by tenants who respected the property and honored their lease obligations. My other rental properties were performing well, and I'd been able to expand my portfolio with additional investments that would secure my retirement and provide legacy wealth for whatever family relationships might develop in the future. Isabella's first birthday came and went without acknowledgement from me, but I thought about her often and hoped she was healthy and happy. Somewhere in the West Hills, she was growing up surrounded by privilege and opportunity, shaped by people who valued status and control over authenticity and connection. I hoped that someday she might curiosity about the grandmother who'd chosen principle over access, and that she would understand the difference between love and manipulation. The winter months brought clarity and peace that I hadn't experienced in years. I was free from the emotional manipulation and financial exploitation that had characterized my relationship with Derek and his new family. My investment properties provided financial security and independence. My work at the bank was fulfilling and meaningful, and my relationship with Frank was developing into something mature and supportive. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices without interference or rescue. Derek had chosen his path, and I had chosen mine. The intersection of those paths had been painful and damaging, but the separation was necessary for both of our futures. I was no longer the woman who would sacrifice her own well-being for someone else's comfort, and that transformation was worth every relationship it had cost me. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, nearly 18 months after Derek had moved out of my property. I was reviewing loan applications at the bank when my personal phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer despite my usual policy of letting unknown calls go to voicemail. The voice on the other end was Derek's, but it sounded different, strained, exhausted, and lacking the confident tone he'd developed since marrying into the Hampton family. He asked if we could meet for coffee, claiming he had something important to discuss that couldn't be handled over the phone. The request surprised me, given our complete lack of communication since his departure, but something in his voice suggested genuine distress rather than another attempt at manipulation. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in the Hawthorne district, neutral territory that held no memories of our previous conflicts. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we could speak privately, uncertain what to expect from this unexpected reunion. When Derek walked in, I was shocked by his appearance. He looked older than his 35 years, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that suggested chronic stress. Derek approached the table hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. He'd lost weight since I'd last seen him, and his usually perfect grooming showed signs of neglect: wrinkled shirt, scuffed shoes, and hair that needed cutting. The polished professional I'd watched emerge during his marriage had been replaced by someone who looked overwhelmed and defeated. We exchanged awkward greetings while ordering coffee, both of us uncertain how to begin a conversation after so many months of silence. Derek fidgeted with his cup, starting several sentences without finishing them, clearly struggling to find words for whatever had prompted this meeting. I waited patiently, recognizing the signs of someone who needed to talk, but didn't know how to begin. Finally, Derek looked up from his coffee and met my eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. He told me that his marriage was falling apart, that Vanessa had been struggling with severe postpartum depression that had worsened rather than improved over the past year. She'd become increasingly dependent on her mother for everything from childcare decisions to daily emotional support, leaving Derek feeling like an outsider in his own family. The Hampton family's initial enthusiasm for Derek had cooled considerably as the novelty of their daughter's marriage wore off, and the reality of integrating someone from a different background became more challenging. Catherine Hampton had become increasingly critical of Derek's parenting instincts, his career choices, and his inability to provide the kind of emotional support Vanessa needed during her mental health struggles. Richard Hampton had grown impatient with Derek's resistance to changing careers, particularly his refusal to leave the tech industry for a position at Hampton & Associates that would have paid more but required Derek to abandon his professional interests entirely. The job offer had been presented as a generous opportunity, but Derek had gradually realized it was actually a demand for complete submission to Hampton family control over his professional life. Most damaging was the gradual revelation that the house the Hampton family had purchased for Derek and Vanessa came with strings attached that hadn't been clearly explained during the initial gift presentation. The property was held in a trust controlled by Richard Hampton, with Derek and Vanessa having occupancy rights but no actual ownership. Any major decisions about the house required Hampton family approval, and the living situation could be revoked if Derek failed to meet their expectations for behavior and family loyalty. Derek had discovered these conditions when he'd tried to refinance the mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates, only to learn that he had no legal standing to make financial decisions about a property he didn't actually own. The realization that his housing security was entirely dependent on his in-laws' continued approval had been devastating, particularly given his previous experience with family housing arrangements. The conversation revealed the depth of Derek's isolation within his new life. His old friends had been systematically excluded from his social circle, replaced by the Hampton family's associates, who treated him with polite condescension rather than genuine friendship. His career had stagnated as he spent increasing amounts of time fulfilling family obligations and social commitments that left little energy for professional development. Most heartbreaking was Derek's description of his relationship with Isabella, who was now walking and beginning to talk. Catherine Hampton had established herself as the primary caregiver and decision-maker for Isabella's daily routine, education planning, and social development. Derek felt like a peripheral figure in his daughter's life, consulted occasionally, but never truly included in the important decisions about her upbringing. Vanessa's mental health struggles had created additional strain on their marriage, with Catherine Hampton positioning herself as the expert on both childcare and psychological support. Vanessa had become increasingly dependent on her mother's guidance and approval, leaving little room for Derek's input or involvement in addressing their family's challenges. He felt like he was watching his wife and daughter from the outside, unable to provide meaningful support or connection. As Derek shared these revelations, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The patterns I'd observed during his courtship and early marriage had intensified rather than resolved, confirming my worst fears about the Hampton family's controlling nature. but seeing my son's genuine distress and recognition of his mistakes touched something deep inside me that I'd tried to protect from further damage. Derek's voice broke as he described the loneliness of his situation. He'd realized that he'd traded his authentic relationships for social status and financial security, but the price had been his independence and self-respect. He missed the person he'd been before the marriage, the values he'd learned growing up, and the family connections he'd severed in pursuit of acceptance from people who would never truly accept him. The most difficult part of Derek's confession was his acknowledgement of how he'd treated me during our housing dispute. He admitted that he'd been embarrassed by his dependence on my generosity and had allowed the Hampton family to reframe our relationship in ways that made him feel less ashamed of his situation. Instead of appreciating my support, he'd convinced himself that I was being manipulative and controlling, projecting the Hampton family's behaviors onto me to make his rebellion feel justified. Derek apologized for the legal threats, the accusations of greed, and the cruel things he'd said during our final conversations. He recognized that I'd been supporting him financially and emotionally for years, and that his response to my reasonable requests had been shaped by shame and external pressure, rather than legitimate grievances. The apology was heartfelt and specific, acknowledging particular incidents and their impact rather than offering vague expressions of regret. What Derek wanted from our meeting wasn't entirely clear, even to him. He wasn't asking me to solve his problems or provide financial assistance, but he seemed to need connection with someone who knew him before his transformation and could remind him of who he'd once been. He talked about missing our conversations, our shared humor, and the simple comfort of being accepted without conditions or expectations for performance. I listened to Derek's story with careful attention, recognizing both the genuine pain in his account and the possibility that this crisis might be temporary rather than transformative. People in difficult situations often seek comfort from relationships they've previously damaged, only to return to their problematic patterns once the immediate crisis passes. I wanted to believe that Derek's recognition of his mistakes was permanent, but experience had taught me to be cautious about trusting dramatic revelations during times of stress. When Derek finished speaking, he looked at me with an expression of hopeful vulnerability that reminded me of the child he'd once been. He asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship, acknowledging that he'd destroyed my trust and had no right to expect forgiveness. He wanted to know if I would be willing to be part of Isabella's life, recognizing that his previous exclusion of me had deprived his daughter of important family connections. My response was measured and honest. I told Derek that I appreciated his apology and his recognition of the mistakes he'd made, but that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent actions rather than words. I explained that I'd built a satisfying life without the drama and manipulation that had characterized our relationship during his marriage, and that I wasn't willing to return to those patterns regardless of the circumstances that had created them. I also told Derek that while I loved him and wanted him to be happy, I couldn't be his emotional support system while he figured out how to manage his marriage and in-law relationships. Those were adult problems that required adult solutions, and my role as his mother didn't include rescuing him from the consequences of choices he'd made despite my warnings and concerns. Regarding Isabella, I explained that my desire to be part of her life hadn't diminished, but that any relationship would need to be built on stable foundations rather than crisis-driven reconciliation. I wouldn't accept conditional access to my granddaughter that could be revoked whenever family tensions arose, and I wouldn't participate in arrangements that required me to submit to Hampton family authority or approval. Derek nodded throughout my response, seeming to understand the boundaries I was establishing even if they weren't what he'd hoped to hear. He asked if we could maintain regular contact while he worked through his marital problems, suggesting monthly coffee meetings where we could rebuild our relationship gradually and carefully. He promised that he wouldn't ask for financial assistance or try to involve me in his conflicts with Vanessa or her family. I agreed to periodic meetings, with clear understanding about their purpose and limitations. Derek needed to demonstrate through consistent behavior that his recognition of past mistakes was genuine and permanent, not just a temporary response to current difficulties. I was willing to rebuild our relationship slowly, but only if he could prove that he'd truly changed, rather than simply seeking comfort during a difficult period. Our conversation ended with tentative plans to meet again in a month, giving Derek time to consider whether he was truly ready for the kind of honest, boundaried relationship I was offering. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic, but also realistic about the challenges of rebuilding trust with someone who'd hurt me deeply and might do so again if his circumstances improved. Over the following weeks, I reflected on Derek's revelations and their implications for our potential reconciliation. His description of the Hampton family's control tactics confirmed everything I'd observed and suspected, but it also raised questions about his ability to extract himself from their influence. The financial entanglements, housing dependencies, and social isolation he'd described weren't easily resolved, and his recognition of the problems didn't automatically provide solutions. I found myself hoping that Derek's crisis might be the catalyst for genuine change, but also prepared for the possibility that he might reconcile with Vanessa and return to previous patterns once the immediate stress passed. People often seek support from family during difficult times, only to forget that support once their situations stabilize. I'd seen this pattern in my banking work with clients who promised to change their financial behaviors during crises but returned to problematic spending once their immediate problems were resolved. The month between our first meeting and our scheduled follow-up passed slowly, with me wondering whether Derek would follow through on his commitment to gradual reconciliation. I continued my normal routines: work at the bank, management of my rental properties, and my developing relationship with Frank, while remaining open to the possibility of renewed connection with my son. Derek called on schedule to confirm our second meeting, which we arranged at the same cafe where we'd had our initial conversation. When he arrived, I was pleased to see that he looked somewhat better, still stressed but more groomed and alert than he'd been during our previous encounter. He'd apparently been using our month apart to think seriously about his situation and possible solutions. During our second conversation, Derek shared more details about his attempts to address the problems in his marriage and his relationship with the Hampton family. He'd suggested couples counseling to Vanessa, but Catherine Hampton had dismissed the idea as unnecessary drama that would reflect poorly on their family's stability. Instead, she'd arranged for Vanessa to see a psychiatrist who was a family friend and could be trusted to handle the situation discreetly. Derek had also tried to assert more independence in his professional life, declining some social obligations, to focus on his career development. Richard Hampton had responded by questioning Derek's priorities and suggesting that his career ambitions were selfish, given Vanessa's mental health needs and Isabella's requirements for stable family support. Most significantly, Derek had begun researching his legal options regarding the house he'd believed was his home. He'd discovered that the trust arrangement gave him no ownership rights and limited occupancy protections, meaning he could be evicted from his own home if he failed to meet Hampton family expectations. The revelation had been devastating, but also clarifying, helping him understand the true nature of his dependence on his in-laws' approval. Derek's growing awareness of his situation's reality was encouraging, but his options for changing it were limited. Leaving Vanessa would mean losing regular access to Isabella and potentially facing a custody battle where the Hampton family's resources would give them significant advantages. Staying in the marriage meant accepting continued control and manipulation, with no guarantee that his compliance would ensure long-term security for his family relationships. Our conversation revealed Derek's growing understanding of the choices he'd made and their consequences, but also his genuine uncertainty about how to move forward. He was trapped in a situation he'd created through his own decisions, and extricating himself would require difficult choices with painful consequences, regardless of which path he chose. I listened to Derek's dilemma with sympathy, but without offering advice about his marriage or custody concerns. Those decisions were his to make, and my role was to support his thinking process rather than influence his conclusions. I did share some observations about patterns I'd noticed in his relationship with the Hampton family, helping him see connections between current problems and behaviors that had been evident from early in his courtship. As our regular meetings continued over the following months, I watched Derek slowly develop clarity about his situation and begin taking small steps toward independence. He started seeing his own therapist, rather than relying on the Hampton family's recommended psychiatrist, giving him a space to process his experiences without external pressure or agenda. Derek also began rebuilding connections with old friends who'd been excluded from his life during his marriage. Marcus Johnson was particularly supportive, providing both emotional support and practical advice about managing difficult family dynamics. Having allies outside the Hampton family circle helped Derek gain perspective on his situation and feel less isolated in his efforts to change it. Most importantly, Derek started making financial preparations for potential independence. He opened individual accounts that weren't connected to Hampton family oversight, began saving money from his salary rather than spending it on social obligations, and researched housing options that would give him genuine ownership and security. These were practical steps toward independence rather than just emotional recognition of problems. The progress was slow and sometimes inconsistent, with Derek occasionally falling back into patterns of seeking Hampton family approval or avoiding difficult conversations with Vanessa. But the overall trajectory was toward greater independence and self-respect, suggesting that his recognition of problems was genuine and his commitment to change was developing roots. Our relationship began to feel more authentic as Derek demonstrated through consistent actions that he was serious about changing his approach to family relationships. He apologized again for specific incidents from our previous conflicts, but more importantly, he began behaving in ways that showed respect for my boundaries and appreciation for my support. The entitled, manipulative person who demanded I sell my property was gradually being replaced by someone who resembled the son I'd raised. 6 months after our initial reunion, Derek made a decision that surprised everyone who knew his situation. He filed for separation from Vanessa, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting shared custody of Isabella. The Hampton family's reaction was immediate and hostile, with threats of legal action and social consequences that revealed the true nature of their approach to family relationships. Derek had prepared for their response by securing his own legal representation and documenting the control and manipulation he'd experienced during his marriage. He'd also established independent housing in a modest apartment that he could afford on his own salary, demonstrating his commitment to genuine independence rather than dependence on any family's financial support. The custody battle was difficult and expensive, with the Hampton family using their resources to paint Derek as an unstable and irresponsible father who'd abandoned his family for selfish reasons. But Derek's documentation of their controlling behavior and his consistent demonstration of responsible parenting helped him secure reasonable visitation rights and shared decision-making authority for Isabella's upbringing. The process was painful for everyone involved, particularly Isabella, who was too young to understand why her family structure was changing. But Derek's commitment to her well-being and his refusal to use her as a weapon in his conflict with the Hampton family helped minimize the damage to their relationship. Throughout Derek's separation and divorce proceedings, our relationship continued to strengthen. I provided emotional support without financial assistance, helping Derek process his experiences while maintaining appropriate boundaries about my involvement in his legal and personal decisions. I was proud of his growing independence and his commitment to authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or control. When Derek's divorce was finalized, he asked if I would like to meet Isabella properly, not as a peripheral figure in Hampton family gatherings, but as her grandmother with my own relationship and role in her life. The invitation was tentative and respectful, acknowledging that I might have legitimate concerns about becoming involved in the ongoing custody complexities. I agreed to meet Isabella during one of Derek's custody weekends, at his modest but comfortable apartment where we could interact naturally without external pressure or agenda. The meeting was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Isabella was a bright, curious 2-year-old who resembled both Derek and me in different ways. But she was also a stranger who had no memory of our previous brief encounters. Building a relationship with Isabella would take time and patience, requiring me to earn her trust and affection rather than assuming automatic connection based on biological relationships. But the opportunity to be part of her life authentically, without conditions or manipulation, felt like a gift worth the effort and uncertainty it would require. Derek's transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine and sustained. He'd learned painful lessons about the difference between genuine love and conditional acceptance, between family support and family control. He'd also learned to value authentic relationships over social status and independence over security that came with strings attached. Our renewed relationship wasn't the same as what we'd had before his marriage. Too much had happened for us to simply return to previous patterns, but it was healthier and more honest, based on mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than assumptions about obligations and entitlements. Derek had earned his way back into my life through consistent demonstration of changed values and priorities, and I had maintained my self-respect by refusing to accept anything less than genuine relationship. The rental property in Eastmoreland continued to provide steady income from responsible tenants who treated it with respect and paid their obligations promptly. The contrast with Derek's previous occupancy remained a reminder of the difference between professional relationships based on clear expectations and family relationships, complicated by emotion and assumption. As I watched Derek begin building an authentic life based on his own values rather than external expectations, I felt proud of both his courage and my own. We'd both made difficult choices that prioritized integrity over convenience, and the result was a relationship that felt genuine and sustainable rather than dependent on crisis or manipulation. The future held uncertainties about custody arrangements, Isabella's adjustment to her family's changes, and Derek's continued development as an independent adult. But for the first time in years, those uncertainties felt like normal family challenges rather than the kind of toxic drama that had characterized our relationship during his marriage to Vanessa. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal creates temporary distance and pain. Derek had learned that authentic relationships require honesty and reciprocity, rather than performance and compliance. Those lessons had cost us both dearly, but they'd also made possible a renewed connection based on mutual respect and genuine affection. 2 years had passed since Derek's divorce was finalized, and our relationship had settled into a comfortable routine built on mutual respect and clear communication. Isabella, now 4 years old, had become a regular presence in my life during Derek's custody weekends. She was a delightful child with an infectious laugh and an insatiable curiosity about everything around her. Watching her grow and develop had become one of my greatest joys, and I treasured the grandmother role I'd never thought I'd have the chance to fulfill. Derek had flourished in his independence, both personally and professionally. His tech startup had been acquired by a larger company, providing him with financial security and stock options that would support a comfortable future for both him and Isabella. He'd moved into a larger apartment with a dedicated bedroom for Isabella and space for the art supplies and musical instruments that reflected her emerging interests and talents. The co-parenting arrangement with Vanessa had stabilized into a workable routine, though it remained complicated by the Hampton family's continued involvement in Isabella's life. Catherine and Richard Hampton maintained their roles as doting grandparents, providing expensive gifts and educational opportunities that Derek couldn't match on his single income. But Derek had learned to focus on the emotional connection and authentic experiences he could provide, rather than competing with the Hampton family's financial resources. My own life had continued to evolve in positive directions. Frank and I had married the previous spring in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, including Derek and Isabella. Frank had embraced his role as stepfather figure to Derek and grandfather figure to Isabella, providing stable male presence and support that enriched all our relationships. His calm demeanor and practical wisdom had been particularly valuable during Isabella's adjustment periods and Derek's ongoing challenges with co-parenting. The rental property business had expanded beyond my initial expectations, with 6 properties now providing substantial passive income that supplemented my bank salary and supported our comfortable lifestyle. Frank's engineering background had been invaluable in evaluating potential investments and managing renovation projects, and together, we'd built a portfolio that would ensure financial security well into our retirement years. My work at the bank had evolved into a senior management position overseeing community development lending, with particular focus on helping first-time homebuyers and small business owners achieve their financial goals. The work was meaningful and utilized both my banking expertise and my real estate investment experience, allowing me to guide other people toward the kind of financial independence I'd built for myself. Isabella's presence in our lives had brought unexpected joy and energy to everything we did. She was bright and articulate, with Derek's analytical mind and what I recognized as my own stubborn determination to understand how things worked. She asked endless questions about everything from why plants grew toward sunlight to how elevators knew which floor to stop on, keeping all the adults in her life constantly researching answers to her increasingly sophisticated inquiries. The relationship between Isabella and me had developed naturally over time, without the forced intimacy or artificial traditions that might have characterized a connection built on guilt or obligation. She knew I was her father's mother and that I loved her very much, but she also understood that her family structure was more complex than some of her friends' situations. Derek had been honest with her about the divorce in age-appropriate ways, helping her understand that sometimes families changed shape, but that love remained constant. Isabella's relationship with the Hampton family remained close, but had evolved as she grew older and more perceptive about adult dynamics. She enjoyed the elaborate birthday parties and expensive gifts they provided, but she also noticed the way they spoke about her father and the subtle criticisms they made about his lifestyle choices. During our quiet times together, she sometimes asked questions that revealed her growing awareness of family tensions and loyalties. One Saturday afternoon in early autumn, while Isabella was helping me plant bulbs in the small garden behind my apartment, she asked me why her Hampton grandparents didn't like her daddy very much. The question caught me off guard, both because of its perceptiveness and because it forced me to navigate the delicate balance between honesty and age-appropriate explanation. I told Isabella that sometimes adults disagreed about important things, and that her Hampton grandparents thought her daddy should make different choices about work and life. I explained that this didn't mean they didn't love her, or that she needed to choose sides between different parts of her family. I emphasized that her daddy loved her very much, and was working hard to be the best father he could be, and that different people sometimes had different ideas about what that meant. Isabella listened thoughtfully to my explanation, her small hands carefully placing tulip bulbs in the holes we'd dug together. After a few minutes of quiet concentration, she told me that she wished everyone in her family could be friends like we were. The simple statement revealed both her emotional intelligence and her desire for harmony that was complicated by adult conflicts beyond her control. That conversation with Isabella prompted me to think more deeply about the long-term implications of the family dynamics we'd all created. Isabella was growing up in a world where her father's family and her mother's family maintained separate spheres with different values and expectations. While Derek and I had worked hard to rebuild our relationship on healthy foundations, the broader family ecosystem remained fractured in ways that might become more challenging as Isabella grew older and more aware of the tensions. Derek's continued growth as a person and parent had been remarkable to witness. He'd developed confidence in his own judgment and values, no longer seeking external validation or approval for the choices he made. His relationship with Isabella was warm and engaged, with regular father-daughter dates that included everything from science museums to hiking trails to cooking experiments in his kitchen. He'd learned to prioritize authentic connection over impressive activities, understanding that Isabella valued his attention and presence more than expensive entertainment. The financial stability Derek had achieved through his career success had given him options and security that weren't dependent on anyone else's approval or support. He'd purchased a modest house in a family-friendly neighborhood, providing Isabella with stability and space for her growing independence. The house had a small backyard where Isabella could play safely, and a spare room that Derek had converted into an art studio where they worked on creative projects together. Derek's dating life had been cautious and thoughtful, with only one serious relationship since his divorce. He'd introduced Isabella to his girlfriend, Sarah, gradually and carefully, making sure Isabella was comfortable with the new dynamic before allowing the relationship to become more serious. Sarah was a teacher who understood children's developmental needs and had been patient and respectful in building her own connection with Isabella. The relationship between Derek and Sarah had developed slowly and openly, with honest conversations about the complexities of blended families and the particular challenges of co-parenting with difficult former in-laws. Sarah's professional experience with children and families had been valuable in helping Derek navigate Isabella's emotional needs during transitions and adjustments. My relationship with Sarah had also developed positively, based on our shared commitment to Isabella's well-being and our mutual respect for Derek's growth as a person and parent. Sarah didn't try to replace anyone or compete for Isabella's affection, but simply provided additional stable adult presence and support in Isabella's expanding world. The Hampton family's response to Derek's new relationship had been predictably critical and manipulative. Catherine Hampton had made pointed comments about the importance of stability in Isabella's life and the potential confusion created by introducing new romantic relationships too quickly. Richard Hampton had questioned whether Derek was prioritizing his own desires over Isabella's needs, suggesting that single parenting might be more appropriate than subjecting Isabella to uncertain romantic attachments. Derek's response to these criticisms had demonstrated his continued growth and independence. Instead of becoming defensive or seeking their approval, he'd calmly explained his approach to introducing Sarah into Isabella's life and his commitment to ensuring that any romantic relationship would enhance rather than complicate Isabella's stability. He'd set clear boundaries about the Hampton family's input on his personal decisions while maintaining their access to Isabella and respecting their role as her grandparents. The balance Derek had achieved between independence and cooperation in his co-parenting relationship was delicate but functional. He'd learned to distinguish between legitimate concerns about Isabella's well-being and attempts to control his personal choices through criticism and manipulation. This discernment had allowed him to maintain productive communication with Vanessa about practical parenting matters while declining to engage with attempts to influence his broader life decisions. Vanessa's mental health had stabilized somewhat in the years since the divorce, though she remained heavily dependent on her parents for emotional and practical support. She'd developed her own interests and friendships outside the Hampton family circle, but her confidence in her own judgment remained limited. The co-parenting relationship worked best when focused on Isabella's immediate needs, rather than broader philosophical discussions about parenting approaches or family values. Isabella's school performance and social development had remained strong throughout the family transitions, suggesting that the adults in her life had succeeded in protecting her from the worst effects of their conflicts. She was popular with classmates, performed well academically, and showed creativity and leadership in group activities. Her teachers described her as mature for her age but not inappropriately serious, indicating healthy emotional development, despite her complex family situation. The weekends Isabella spent with Derek and me had become special times for all of us, filled with activities that reflected our shared interests and values. We visited farmers' markets, explored nature trails, worked on craft projects, and cooked meals together that often reflected my family's Salvadoran heritage. Isabella had become particularly fond of helping me make pupusas, carefully forming the masa around cheese and bean fillings, while asking questions about my childhood and her great-grandparents' immigration story. These cultural connections had become increasingly important to me as Isabella grew older and more capable of understanding her family history. The Hampton family's emphasis on their social status and American success story had left little room for acknowledging Isabella's Salvadoran heritage or the immigrant experiences that had shaped Derek's upbringing. During our time together, I was able to share stories, foods, and traditions that connected Isabella to a broader sense of identity and belonging. Isabella's curiosity about her cultural background had led to wonderful conversations about resilience, hard work, and the dreams that had motivated her great-grandparents to build new lives in a foreign country. She was particularly fascinated by stories about my parents' journey to America and the sacrifices they'd made to provide educational opportunities for their children. These discussions helped Isabella understand the values that had shaped her father's character and the importance of appreciating opportunities that others had worked hard to provide. Frank's presence in these family gatherings had added richness and stability that benefited everyone involved. His engineering background made him a natural teacher for Isabella's scientific questions, and his calm demeanor provided steady influence during moments when family dynamics became complicated. Isabella adored Frank and had gradually begun referring to him as her grandfather, a development that touched both of us deeply and demonstrated her capacity for expanding her understanding of family beyond traditional boundaries. The financial lessons I'd learned through my real estate investments had become part of Isabella's informal education during our time together. She accompanied me to property visits, observing tenant interactions and learning about the responsibilities of property ownership. She was too young to understand complex financial concepts, but she was developing early awareness of the connection between hard work, responsible management, and financial security. Isabella's questions about money and property ownership had led to age-appropriate discussions about the difference between earning and inheriting wealth, the importance of education and skill development, and the value of treating people with respect regardless of their economic circumstances. These conversations were carefully balanced to avoid criticizing the Hampton family's approach to wealth, while still emphasizing the values that had guided my own financial journey. Derek's involvement in these educational moments had been encouraging, evidence of his continued commitment to raising Isabella with grounded values despite the privileged circumstances she experienced in other parts of her life. He'd begun his own conversations with Isabella about the importance of kindness, hard work, and gratitude, helping her understand that material advantages came with responsibilities to use them thoughtfully and generously. The contrast between Isabella's experiences in different family environments had become more apparent as she grew older and more articulate about her observations. She noticed that her Hampton grandparents' house had more expensive possessions, but that her time with Derek and me involved more hands-on activities and personal attention. She was beginning to understand that different people expressed love and care in different ways, and that neither approach was necessarily better than the other. This growing sophistication in Isabella's understanding of family dynamics had made me hopeful about her ability to navigate the complexities of her situation as she continued to mature. She was developing the emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills that would help her form her own opinions about relationships and values, rather than simply accepting what different adults told her about how she should think and feel. One evening in late November, while Derek, Sarah, Frank, and I were cleaning up after dinner at our house, Isabella made an announcement that surprised all of us. She told us that she'd been thinking about Thanksgiving and that she wanted to have a celebration with all the people who made her feel happy and loved, not just the people who were related to her by blood or marriage. Isabella's idea for an inclusive Thanksgiving celebration reflected her growing ability to think independently about relationships and family structure. She wanted to invite Derek's friend Marcus, Sarah's sister who lived nearby, and even Tom Chen, my property management consultant who'd become a family friend over the years. Her vision was of a gathering based on genuine affection and mutual support, rather than obligation or traditional family roles. Derek was initially concerned about how the Hampton family might react to Isabella's desire for an alternative Thanksgiving celebration, particularly since they'd already made elaborate plans for the holiday that assumed Isabella's participation. But Isabella's enthusiasm for her inclusive celebration was so genuine and thoughtful that Derek decided to support her vision while also ensuring she could participate in Hampton family traditions. The solution we developed was to hold our own celebration on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, giving Isabella the experience she wanted while still allowing her to fulfill her obligations to the Hampton family's more formal holiday gathering. The compromise satisfied Isabella's desire for creative family building while avoiding direct conflict with existing custody and family arrangements. Our alternative Thanksgiving celebration turned out to be one of the most joyful family gatherings I'd ever experienced. Isabella had helped plan the menu, set the table with handmade decorations, and prepared a speech about gratitude that brought tears to everyone's eyes. The mix of people she'd chosen to include created wonderful conversations and connections that might never have developed through traditional family gatherings. Isabella's ability to bring people together through her genuine warmth and inclusive spirit had demonstrated leadership qualities that impressed all the adults present. She moved easily between conversations, making sure everyone felt included and valued, and her obvious joy in creating this chosen family celebration was infectious and heartwarming. The success of Isabella's Thanksgiving experiment had given me hope about her future ability to build healthy relationships and create positive family dynamics. Despite the complicated circumstances of her childhood, she was learning to value authentic connection over social obligation, to appreciate diversity in relationships and perspectives, and to take initiative in creating the kind of community she wanted to be part of. Derek's pride in Isabella's social and emotional development had been evident throughout the evening, and his willingness to support her vision for family celebrations had demonstrated his continued growth as a parent who prioritized his daughter's authentic needs over external expectations or approval. The Derek I'd raised was fully present in those moments, and I felt deep satisfaction in seeing the values I'd tried to instill in him being passed on to the next generation. As winter settled over Portland and the holiday season approached, our extended chosen family had found its rhythm and established traditions that reflected our shared values and genuine affection for each other. Isabella's upcoming 5th birthday would be celebrated with both Hampton family extravagance and our own more modest but personally meaningful gathering, giving her experience with different approaches to marking important occasions. The rental properties continued to provide steady income that supported our comfortable lifestyle and gave us flexibility to be present for Isabella's activities and milestones. Frank and I had discussed the possibility of establishing an education fund for Isabella that would supplement whatever resources the Hampton family provided, ensuring she would have maximum opportunities for higher education and career development. Regardless of how family relationships evolved over time, Derek's career continued to flourish with the expanded opportunities created by his company's acquisition, and he'd been approached about leadership roles that would provide even greater financial security and professional fulfillment. His confidence in his own abilities and judgment had grown to the point where he could evaluate these opportunities based on their merit rather than external validation or approval. The relationship between Derek and the Hampton family had settled into a stable pattern of polite cooperation focused on Isabella's needs and activities. The initial hostility and manipulation had been replaced by careful distance and formal courtesy that protected everyone's boundaries while allowing Isabella to maintain relationships with all parts of her extended family. Most importantly, Isabella was thriving emotionally, academically, and socially in ways that suggested the adults in her life had succeeded in creating stability and support, despite the complexities of her family structure. She was confident, curious, and kind, with a strong sense of her own worth and an appreciation for the different people who contributed to her life and development. The lessons Derek and I had learned about authentic relationships, healthy boundaries, and the difference between love and control were being passed on to Isabella through our daily interactions and the example we set in our own relationship. She was growing up with an understanding that family could be created through choice and commitment as well as biology, and that the most important relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or expectation. As I watched Isabella help Frank build a birdhouse in our garage one December afternoon, carefully measuring boards and selecting the right screws for each connection, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us all together. The pain and conflict that had characterized my relationship with Derek during his marriage had ultimately led to growth and healing that benefited everyone, including Isabella, who was now surrounded by adults who had learned to prioritize her well-being over their own egos or agendas. The rental property in Eastmoreland continued to generate income from responsible tenants who treated it with respect and fulfilled their obligations promptly. But more than its financial value, the house had become a symbol of the importance of maintaining boundaries and self-respect, even in the face of family pressure and emotional manipulation. The lessons learned through that conflict had strengthened all of our relationships and provided a foundation for the healthy family dynamics we'd built together. Isabella's future stretched ahead with possibilities that included the best of all the influences in her life, the Hampton family's resources and opportunities, Derek's values and emotional intelligence, and the cultural heritage and resilience that connected her to previous generations who had overcome challenges to create better lives for their children. She was being raised with tools and perspectives that would help her navigate whatever complexities lay ahead, supported by adults who had learned from their own mistakes and were committed to her authentic well-being above all other considerations. 3 years later, on a crisp morning in October, I found myself standing in the kitchen of my home, preparing breakfast for what had become our traditional preschool ritual with Isabella. She was now 7 years old, a second grader with an infectious giggle and an insatiable appetite for stories about her family history. Frank was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, occasionally sharing interesting headlines, while Isabella carefully arranged her art supplies for a project she'd been working on all week. The normalcy of the scene struck me with its quiet perfection. After years of conflict, manipulation, and heartbreak, we'd built something genuinely peaceful and authentic. Isabella chattered about her upcoming school presentation on family traditions, explaining how she planned to share stories about both her Hampton grandparents' formal dinner parties and our weekend pupusa-making sessions. Her ability to appreciate different aspects of her complex family without feeling torn between them was a testament to the emotional intelligence she'd developed, despite the challenges of her early years. Derek arrived right on schedule, as he had every Tuesday morning for the past year. Tuesday breakfasts had become our weekly check-in, a time for family planning and quiet conversation before the day's responsibilities took over. He looked relaxed and confident in a way that still amazed me, considering the anxious, people-pleasing person he'd become during his marriage to Vanessa. His relationship with Sarah had continued to flourish, built on the foundation of mutual respect and honest communication that his first marriage had lacked. Sarah had become an integral part of our extended family, bringing her own warmth and insights to our gatherings. Her background as an elementary school teacher had been invaluable in understanding Isabella's developmental needs, and her genuine affection for Isabella was evident in the patient attention she gave to every story, question, and creative project. The relationship between Derek and Sarah was characterized by the kind of partnership I'd always hoped Derek would find, based on shared values and mutual support rather than social climbing and external validation. Isabella hugged her father, enthusiastically, immediately launching into an animated description of her school project and seeking his input on which family stories would be most interesting to her classmates. Derek listened with the kind of focused attention that had become his trademark as a parent, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions that honored both Isabella's creative vision and the complex realities of their family situation. The conversation turned to Isabella's upcoming 8th birthday party, which had become an annual negotiation between different family factions with varying ideas about appropriate celebration. The Hampton family traditionally favored elaborate events at expensive venues with professionally coordinated activities and extensive guest lists. Derek preferred smaller gatherings focused on Isabella's actual friends and interests, while I advocated for celebrations that reflected Isabella's own preferences rather than adult expectations about impressive parties. This year, Isabella had surprised everyone by requesting a camping birthday party at a state park, complete with hiking, s'mores around a campfire, and sleeping in tents under the stars. Her vision was adventurous and unconventional, requiring coordination between multiple adults and careful planning for outdoor activities with a group of energetic 7- and 8-year-olds. The Hampton family had initially been horrified by the idea, suggesting it was too rustic and potentially dangerous for a proper birthday celebration. Derek had supported Isabella's camping party idea from the beginning, recognizing it as an expression of her growing independence and her genuine love of outdoor activities. He'd spent weekends teaching her basic camping skills, and they'd taken several successful father-daughter camping trips that had built her confidence and enthusiasm for outdoor adventures. His willingness to prioritize Isabella's authentic interests over adult convenience or social expectations demonstrated the growth he'd achieved as a parent. The logistics of organizing a camping birthday party for 8 children required careful coordination with parents, park officials, and weather forecasts. Frank's engineering background had been invaluable in planning the practical aspects of the event, from site selection to equipment lists to safety protocols. His enthusiasm for the project had been contagious, and he'd already begun preparing camping games and nature activities that would keep the children engaged and entertained throughout the weekend. Catherine Hampton had eventually agreed to attend the camping party, though her preparations suggested she viewed it as an endurance test rather than a celebration. She'd purchased expensive outdoor gear and made reservations at a nearby hotel as backup accommodations, clearly expecting the camping experience to be uncomfortable and unsuitable for civilized celebration. Her attitude was condescending but not openly hostile, representing the kind of grudging cooperation that had characterized her relationship with Derek since the divorce. Richard Hampton had declined to attend the camping party, citing business obligations and expressing concern about the appropriateness of overnight outdoor activities for young children. His absence was actually a relief for everyone involved, as his criticism and controlling behavior had consistently created tension. At family gatherings, Isabella had accepted his decision without apparent disappointment, suggesting that she'd learned to appreciate the presence of adults who genuinely enjoyed her company rather than feeling hurt by those who didn't. The camping party planning had revealed interesting dynamics about Isabella's friendships and social development. She'd chosen a diverse group of classmates for her guest list, including children from various cultural and economic backgrounds who shared her interests in art, nature, and adventure rather than selecting friends based on social status or parental connections. Her choices reflected values that Derek and I had tried to model, emphasizing character and genuine compatibility over superficial social considerations. Isabella's school friendships had flourished in an environment that encouraged creativity and individual expression rather than conformity to social expectations. Her teachers consistently praised her kindness toward classmates, her enthusiasm for learning, and her ability to include others in group activities. She was developing leadership skills based on empathy and collaboration rather than dominance or manipulation, suggesting that the lessons about healthy relationships were taking root in positive ways. The academic year had brought new challenges and opportunities for Isabella's intellectual development. She'd discovered a passion for science experiments and had begun conducting elaborate investigations in our kitchen, much to Frank's delight and my occasional concern about the condition of my cooking utensils. Her curiosity about how things worked had led to wonderful conversations about engineering, chemistry, and environmental science that engaged all the adults in her life. Isabella's artistic talents had also continued to develop, with her paintings and drawings reflecting both technical skill and emotional depth that impressed her teachers and family members. She'd begun illustrating stories about her family experiences, creating visual narratives that captured the complexity and richness of her life with remarkable insight for someone her age. Her artwork had become treasured gifts for birthdays and holidays, each piece reflecting her unique perspective on the people and experiences that shaped her world. The financial stability that Derek had achieved through his career success had allowed him to provide Isabella with opportunities for extracurricular activities that matched her interests, rather than reflecting parental ambitions or social expectations. She was taking piano lessons, participating in a children's hiking club, and attending art classes at the community center. These activities were chosen based on Isabella's enthusiasm and aptitude, rather than their potential to impress other adults or build college applications for a 7-year-old. My own career had reached a natural transition point as I approached traditional retirement age. The rental property portfolio Frank and I had built together was generating sufficient passive income to support our lifestyle comfortably, and my leadership role at the bank had evolved into a consulting position that provided flexibility while utilizing my decades of experience in community development lending. The transition felt natural and empowering, allowing me to remain engaged with meaningful work while having more time for family relationships and personal interests. The success of my real estate investments had exceeded my original expectations, providing not only financial security, but also a sense of accomplishment that came from building something lasting through careful planning and hard work. The properties continued to appreciate in value while generating steady income, creating wealth that would support our family's needs and eventually provide educational opportunities for Isabella's future. Frank and I had begun discussing plans for traveling during our retirement years, with Isabella accompanying us on some adventures that would broaden her understanding of different cultures and environments. We'd already taken several family trips that combined sightseeing with educational experiences, visiting historical sites and natural wonders that sparked Isabella's curiosity about the world beyond Portland. These shared adventures had strengthened our family bonds while creating memories that would last for decades. The relationship between Derek and Vanessa had stabilized into a functional co-parenting partnership that prioritized Isabella's needs, while minimizing conflict between the adults. Vanessa's mental health had improved significantly with appropriate treatment and the support of her family, though she remained somewhat fragile and dependent on others for major life decisions. The custody arrangement worked well because both parents had learned to focus on Isabella's well-being, rather than using her as a weapon in their personal conflicts. Vanessa had begun expressing appreciation for Derek's growth as a parent and his commitment to Isabella's emotional development. She'd recognized that his influence had been positive for Isabella's confidence and independence, even when it conflicted with Hampton family preferences for more controlled and supervised activities. This acknowledgement had reduced some of the tension in their co-parenting relationship and created space for more collaborative decision-making about Isabella's upbringing. The Hampton family's relationship with Isabella remained close, but had evolved as she grew older and more capable of independent thinking. Catherine Hampton continued to provide expensive gifts and elaborate experiences, but Isabella had begun expressing preferences for simpler activities and more personal attention from the adults in her life. Her growing ability to articulate her own needs and interests had gradually shifted family dynamics toward greater respect for her autonomy. Isabella's questions about family relationships had become more sophisticated as she matured, reflecting her growing awareness of the complexities that had shaped her early years. She understood that her parents' divorce had been difficult for everyone involved, but she also recognized that the current arrangements allowed her to have meaningful relationships with all the important adults in her life. Her acceptance of family complexity was remarkable for someone her age and suggested resilience that would serve her well throughout her life. One afternoon in late fall, while Isabella and I were raking leaves in our backyard, she asked me about the time when her father had lived in my house and why he'd moved out. The question had been building for months as she pieced together fragments of adult conversations and developed her own theories about family history. Her curiosity was natural and deserved an honest response that honored both her intelligence and her emotional needs. I explained to Isabella that sometimes adults make mistakes when they're trying to figure out how to balance different relationships and responsibilities. I told her that her father had been going through a difficult time when he was married to her mother, and that some of the adults in his life had given him advice that wasn't very good. I emphasized that people can learn from their mistakes and become better at making decisions that reflect their true values and priorities. Isabella listened thoughtfully to my explanation, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her desire to understand rather than judge the adults involved in these complicated dynamics. She seemed particularly interested in the concept that people could change and grow, asking whether that meant her Hampton grandparents might also learn to be different if they wanted to. Her optimism about human potential was touching and reflected the security she felt in her current family arrangements. The conversation with Isabella about family history had reminded me of how far we'd all traveled from the conflict and pain that had characterized our relationships during Derek's marriage. The growth that Derek had achieved as a person and parent was evident in every interaction with Isabella, and the healthy boundaries we'd established had created space for authentic relationships based on love and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. Derek's professional success had continued to expand, with opportunities for advancement that reflected both his technical skills and his leadership abilities. He'd learned to evaluate career decisions based on their alignment with his values and their impact on his family life, rather than seeking external validation or status. This approach had led to choices that supported both his professional growth and his commitment to being present and engaged as Isabella's father. The upcoming camping birthday party had become a symbol of the kind of celebration that reflected Isabella's authentic interests and our family's values. The elaborate planning required for outdoor activities with children had brought out the best in everyone involved, with Frank designing nature scavenger hunts, Sarah organizing art projects using natural materials, and Derek coordinating hiking, routes appropriate for young adventurers. My own contribution to the camping party planning had involved researching park facilities and coordinating with other parents, but more importantly, it had provided opportunities to share stories about my own childhood camping experiences with my parents and brother. Isabella was fascinated by tales of budget camping trips that had taken our family to national parks and state forests throughout the Pacific Northwest, creating memories that had lasted decades despite their modest cost and simple pleasures. The contrast between Isabella's elaborate Hampton family celebrations and our more modest outdoor adventures had become a source of valuable lessons about different approaches to marking important occasions. Isabella was learning that meaningful celebrations could take many forms, and that the most important element was the genuine affection and attention of the people who participated, rather than the expense or sophistication of the activities. As Isabella's 8th birthday approached, I reflected on the journey that had brought our family to this point of stability and authentic connection. The pain of Derek's rejection during his marriage had been devastating at the time, but it had ultimately led to growth and healing that benefited everyone, especially Isabella, who was now surrounded by adults who had learned to prioritize her genuine needs over their own egos or social expectations. The lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and authentic relationships that had emerged from our family conflicts were being passed on to Isabella through daily examples and conversations. She was growing up with an understanding that love required respect and reciprocity, that family could be created through choice and commitment as well as biology, and that the most important relationships were based on mutual care rather than obligation or manipulation. On the morning of Isabella's camping birthday party, our extended chosen family gathered at the state park with tents, sleeping bags, and enough outdoor equipment to support a small expedition. The children arrived with excitement and anticipation, ready for adventures that would create memories lasting far beyond childhood. Catherine Hampton appeared in her expensive outdoor gear, looking determined to endure whatever rustic challenges lay ahead for the sake of her beloved granddaughter. The weekend unfolded with the kind of joyful chaos that characterizes successful children's parties, with hiking adventures, nature crafts, campfire cooking, and storytelling under the stars. Isabella moved through the activities with confidence and delight, clearly in her element among friends who shared her enthusiasm for outdoor exploration. Her happiness was infectious, creating an atmosphere of celebration that included even the most reluctant adult participants. As I watched Isabella roast marshmallows for s'mores while sharing camping stories with her friends, I felt profound gratitude for the path that had led us to this moment. The conflict and heartbreak that had nearly destroyed our family relationships had ultimately taught us lessons about love, respect, and authenticity that were now shaping Isabella's understanding of how families could function at their best. The camping party was more than a birthday celebration. It was a demonstration of the kind of family we'd chosen to become through years of growth, forgiveness, and commitment to each other's genuine well-being. Isabella was surrounded by adults who had learned to put her needs first while maintaining their own dignity and values, creating a foundation of security and love that would support her throughout her life. Derek's transformation from an insecure, approval-seeking young man into a confident, principled father had been remarkable to witness. His relationship with Isabella was characterized by the kind of present, engaged parenting that created lasting bonds and positive childhood memories. The values he was modeling for Isabella, independence, integrity, kindness, and resilience, were the same ones I'd tried to instill in him during his childhood, now being passed on to the next generation with wisdom gained through experience and growth. As the weekend came to an end and families began packing up their camping gear, Isabella thanked everyone for making her birthday celebration perfect. Her genuine appreciation for the efforts everyone had made to support her vision touched all the adults present and reinforced the understanding that our chosen family arrangements were built on mutual love and respect, rather than obligation or expectation. The success of Isabella's camping party had created new traditions and strengthened relationships that would continue to evolve as she grew older. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that authentic celebrations based on genuine interests and values could bring out the best in everyone involved, creating memories and connections that would last far beyond childhood. Standing around the dying embers of our campfire on Sunday evening, watching Isabella share quiet conversations with the adults who'd become her chosen family, I understood that we'd achieved something precious and rare. Through years of conflict, growth, and forgiveness, we'd created relationships based on authentic love rather than social obligation, mutual respect rather than control, and genuine care rather than manipulation. The rental property that had once been a source of family conflict had become a symbol of the importance of maintaining boundaries and self-respect, even in the face of emotional pressure. The income it generated continued to provide financial security, but its greater value lay in the lessons it had taught about standing firm in one's principles and refusing to accept treatment that compromised dignity or integrity. Isabella's future stretched ahead with possibilities supported by the best qualities of all the adults in her life: the Hampton family's resources and opportunities, Derek's emotional intelligence and principled decision-making, Sarah's educational expertise and nurturing spirit, Frank's stability and practical wisdom, and my own experiences with resilience and financial independence. She was being raised with tools and perspectives that would help her navigate whatever challenges lay ahead, surrounded by people who had learned from their mistakes and were committed to her authentic success and happiness. As we loaded the last of our camping equipment into vehicles and prepared to return to our regular routines, I felt deep satisfaction with the family we'd built through choice, commitment, and hard-won wisdom. The pain of Derek's initial rejection had been transformed into growth that benefited everyone, especially Isabella, who was now thriving in an environment characterized by love, respect, and genuine care for her well-being above all other considerations. The story that had begun with conflict and heartbreak had evolved into something beautiful and sustainable, proving that families could heal from even the deepest wounds when people were willing to grow, forgive, and prioritize love over pride. Isabella's laughter echoing across the campground as we said our goodbyes was the perfect soundtrack to a chapter that had ended with hope, healing, and the promise of many more adventures together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.